The ideas of socialism have a powerful pull on the hearts of men. That's been the case for hundreds of years. It has not changed. It is still the case.
Modern communism has this immense appeal across the last 2 centuries, across cultures, and we have to ask, why is that so enduring?
Since the dawn of politics and philosophy, human beings have noticed the trend towards oppression and inequality, and have been driven to a central question: how does a society create and protect human flourishing?
If you read Aristotle, he talks about the divide between the few and the many. And Marx is taking a side in that dispute, which will always plague political societies.
At its core, socialism represents a very humane ideal. It's a system that is driven not by a desire to brutalize people, but to give them a good life.
A society where there's no poverty, where everybody actually has the ability to lead a meaningful life. That is a good goal.
But an altruistic goal does not make a political system just. Marxists, socialists, and communists claim that communist society is inevitable and that its eventual rise will usher in unprecedented equality and freedom. The claim that communism leads inexorably to human flourishing must be evaluated.
The dream itself, complete abolition of human self-interest, is completely at odds with human nature.
Marxism is an especially bleak series of examples. The most brutal, most repressive, wildest utopian schemes are, I think, in history Marxist.
It was a failure, and it has to be a failure, and always will be.
To understand communism, you have to understand the person it came from. Karl Marx. The 19th century Europe in which he grew up was a world in upheaval.
The world of the late 18th century and the early 19th century is the world of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution. Poverty is becoming more obvious. The great wealth inequality is becoming more obvious, especially because Industrial Revolution is predicated on the notion of private ownership of businesses. The successful industrialists are starting to make huge amounts of money. The kinds of money that we have never observed in the history of humanity. And more people are starting to worry about it, be concerned that in fact that sort of wealth inequality and income inequality is causing serious social conflict and that will lead to terrible consequences.
The factory system was the principal consequence of the Industrial Revolution. Factories involved large concentrations of workers, large concentrations of capital behind the manufacturing enterprise. These developments created major change in European societies and American society. Larger concentrations of workers around factories meant larger concentrations of workers in cities. Workers were not living well in a material sense. This is going to produce stresses in society.
The key date in the 18th century is 1789 with the French Revolution, the end of the ancient regime of Europe dominated by monarchy, nobility, and clergy. The revolution had ended that in France and put that idea in other places that they either did or should end it. And the new societies that came out of that were embracing new economic trends which caused widespread social dislocation, people moving from the countryside to the city, individual producers being displaced in favor of factory ownership, and all in the setting of this new class society where what Marx called the bourgeoisie had become prominent. So people who formerly had not been that important in governing, running societies, people who own businesses, whether they're small businesses or big businesses, had not been at the center of life in the old Europe, and now they were.
Amidst this economic revolution and the accompanying social tensions, Karl Marx was born in Trier, Germany, to an upper-middle-class family on May 5, 1818.
Karl Marx himself was certainly not working class. He was not particularly high-born. He was what you might call a kind of a bourgeois. He was neither high-born or wealthy enough to live a life of social consequence, but he was also, to some extent, from a wealthy enough family that he could spend down his inheritance as something like a perpetual graduate student. He did actually finish a doctorate. He did a sort of a mail-order PhD diploma of sorts from the University of Jena. He then bounced from job to job. He would find various admirers who would hire him for a time to dabble in journalism or to edit this or that newspaper.
Marx, as a younger man living in the first half of the 19th century, becomes a kind of a radical journalist, is writing about what he's observing, the injustices of the Western European world of that time, and becomes involved in several different socialist causes, culminating in the revolutions, attempted revolutions of 1848. As a result of the failures of these revolutions, he had to flee. And he fled to London, and he lived out the rest of his life in Britain. He died in 1883.
In the end, it was Friedrich Engels who became his principal sponsor. Engels, unlike Marx, came from a fairly prosperous, a really prosperous family. They owned a textile business. So he's the one who actually introduced Marx for the first time to factory life in England.
The relationship between Marx and Engels is an interesting one. They were collaborators, and Marx, very verbose, very florid writer. Engels would sometimes help him write things to get clear. Engels was a very clear writer. The Communist Manifesto, the thought was Marx, the writing was Engels.
Dear Fred, have just finished correcting the last sheet, 49th of the book. I owe it to you alone that it was possible. Without your self-sacrifice for me, I could not possibly have managed the immense labor demanded by the 3 volumes. I embrace you, full of thanks. Salute, my dear, valued friend, Karl Marx.
The Communist Manifesto was first published and began to be disseminated at the very beginning of 1848. And 1848 was a year of revolution in Europe. It began as a revolution in France, the overthrow of King Louis Philippe and the creation of a second French Republic. The first French Republic had been during the Revolution of 1789, that period.
There was another wave of revolutions that swept Europe in 1848, mostly suppressed, but kind of showing the way, the future. These regimes are on life support, kind of waiting for a crisis that's going to put them out of business altogether.
As far as Marxism and communism, the real significance was mostly about coincidence and timing. The manifesto of the Communist Party had very little to do with the revolutions that broke out across Europe, which mostly had to do with local political, economic, or ethnic grievances. But because these revolutions became so powerful, so prominent, made such stirring headlines just at the time that the manifesto was published in multiple languages. This basically made Marx's name and made his fame. He was a household name across Europe by 1848-49. And even though his name would fade from the headlines for a while in the 1850s and 60s, people never really forgot about him. He maintained a certain notoriety in Europe right up into the 1860s and 1870s. The German Revolution, which was also significant for Marx himself personally, in part because of his own origins, and he went back to live in Cologne after the revolution broke out, and he took up an old job with a newspaper. And in the end, there was a crackdown on some of the more radical organizations. And Marx, right before they shut down his newspaper, finally waved the red flag and published something like a kind of a Marxist or socialist message in the newspaper. Marx, in the end, would have to go into exile, and this is when he washed up eventually in London, where he spent most of the rest of his life.
A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other: bourgeoisie and proletariat.
Marx is an extremely interesting thinker. He came up with a holistic way of looking at the world, meaning that he really thought that he came up with a theory that explains everything. The economic component was an extremely important component of his entire construct of explaining history, explaining socioeconomic forces. Once he got to the UK, he devoted a great deal of his time to studying Adam Smith and even more David Ricardo, who was the next significant economist after Adam Smith. Ricardo really latched on to the part of Smithian value theory. Smith couldn't explain why water, which is so key for life after all, is so cheap, whereas diamonds are so useless to life and yet still so expensive. He couldn't quite explain that. He was baffled by this, that there was such a loose connection between the use value of an object and its price. And Ricardo followed him down that path even further. And he developed what came to be known as the labor theory of value, which is that the value of a particular product is determined by the amount of labor expended upon its production. That meant that capital did not play any kind of role in the creation of value. Only workers created value. And for Marx, that became a huge part of his way of looking at the world, because he looked at the fact that capitalists, businesses were making profit. And he said, if businessmen are making profit, but workers are creating all the value, that means that businessmen are actually exploiting the workers. They are taking some of the value that they're creating and pocketing it for themselves, strictly through virtue of being able to supply capital. And capital is simply tools, machines, right? Things with which workers work that are useful, obviously, but both Ricardo and Marx believe that they do not actually add value. So if capitalists provide the capital, but it doesn't add value, where does the profit come from? It comes from capitalists exploiting the workers and taking some of the value that they've created away from the workers, alienating it from the workers for themselves. And this is the key conflict between the capitalist or bourgeois class and the proletariat class, the working class.
None of of the so-called rights of man, therefore, go beyond egoistic man, beyond man as a member of civil society. That is, an individual withdrawn into himself, into the confines of his private interests and private caprice, and separated from the community. In the rights of man, he is far from being conceived as a species being. The sole bond holding them together is natural necessity, need, and private interest, the preservation of their property and their egoistic selves.
Marx came from a Jewish background, and his German nationalism at the time promised, we can bring you people in, and you can be fully participants in this society. And Marx's father did that. Assimilated, he converted to Christianity, at least nominally, to fit in, and was a lawyer. Marx was always kept by people who were in the system, either his family and then later Engels, who was an industrialist. But the promise of liberation, like you're no longer separated, you're no longer forced to live separately without the same rights, it turned out that wasn't satisfactory, because there's the key element of Marx's psychology. And he wrote a whole essay on this called On the Jewish Question, which really isn't just about the Jewish, but about people being separate from one another, especially separated by rights, by bourgeois society, where you all live under the same laws, but there are still differences. So some people might not like you because of your religious belief or your neighborhood, whatever. And a deep burning rage at that situation, the fact that there are still distinctions and differences between people, I think are the key elements of Marx's background and his education.
The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and with them, the whole relations of society. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere.
Marx is a necessitarian, and he believes that his discovery of these laws of economics are leading us ineluctably to this communist revolution.
They thought these are not simply our views or our passionately held beliefs, although they were, but these are scientific truths we're talking about.
Marxism, like fascism, is a response to a profane liberal society. That by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, liberalism is shorn of the fundamental teachings of natural law, natural rights, Christianity, republican government. What used to be called natural laws have simply become the science of wealth creation or distribution of wealth, circulation of money in an economy. And so it's shorn of the moral foundations. And fascism and Marxism are responses to that, to a liberal society that openly proclaims that it is profane, that there is nothing sacred.
So, 2 trades at 6, shifts itself 2 at 6 to done.
So the Marxist critique is that capitalism provides nothing transcendent, no meaning or purpose to existence. They looked at the capitalist world and they said capitalism can't provide any deeper meaning to existence. It uproots young people. They move 1,500 miles away from home. They have no roots. There's no tradition. And they're taught that nothing matters more than money.
It's the open competitive market.
In the words of Karl Marx, he says, everything, all the relations that used to provide people a sense of meaning and purpose are drowned in the icy waters of cold calculation.
Democracy's most challenging problem is to find a way to translate technical progress into human progress.
So Marx's critique of marriage under capitalism was that it was a form of ownership, that prostitution was a capitalist relation. It was the way of objectifying the human body as something for sale, as opposed to being the means for this free expression. So the social relations are inseparable from the mode of production.
The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social political and spiritual processes of life.
He thought that capitalism inevitably leads to impoverishment of the masses. There is no way to avoid that. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. If masses are left with less and less, of course they're going to be extremely unhappy and they're going to be alienated from their product. Whatever they're working on, the capitalists are taking more and more of that. They are not just going to be exploited, they're going to be also alienated, and that will lead to the breakdown of social order.
Marx's idea was freedom requires us to liberate ourselves from our own individuality and to see ourselves in terms of the larger community that we are part of. And that communal freedom, which is a kind of collective freedom, it requires what we would call today the abolition of private liberty. Freedom means freedom from religion. We have to abolish religion itself in order for there to be true freedom. And that can only take place in terms of this radical transformation of the human condition in which we stop thinking ourselves as individuals and start thinking of ourselves as part of this other larger whole that communism will usher us into when it's finally and completely established.
Marxism develops as a comprehensive answer to resolving and eliminating all the injustices of political systems that don't allow for popular participation and economic system that maldistributes wealth and keeps workers in kind of a permanent state of deprivation.
I think that Marx, like Marxists and communists after him, were answering some pretty fundamental questions, or at least tackling fundamental questions to the human condition. Equality being a huge part of this notion of the equality of souls, which I think very much drew on the broader Christian tradition. More broadly, I think that Marxism and the communism to which it gave rise drew on another aspect of the Western tradition, which is equally powerful. Again, related to Christianity, the notion of eschatology, or a final judgment. The idea that history does proceed with a kind of momentum, leading towards some final judgment or cataclysm. Drawing on all these traditions together, Marx was able to create something that was not entirely new, but which drew on very fertile soil, very fertile ground in the Western tradition. And I think that's what gives it its great narrative pull.
Marx was saying, if all that exists is Homo economicus, that will destroy the family. It already is doing so. And it will destroy religion and the church. And it will also destroy citizenship and nationalism. And if you look at a society that's governed simply by the making of profit, why would anyone sacrifice himself for what? Better corporate profits.
Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital. On private gain. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital.
Marx's theory of history, which he outlines in the Communist Manifesto Part 1, what Marx is saying there is that the whole of history, whole of human history has been the history of the development of different kinds of economic production.
The early Marxists claimed that this was a science. This was part of a historical materialist dialectic. The communist revolution was a fact. It is coming.
Engels actually has a very nice eulogy of Marx, compares him to Darwin. He says that history being the history of class struggle is to Marxism what evolution is to Darwinism.
And in the modern world, you have factory owners, capitalists, and workers. What's different in the bourgeois period, factory period, is that economic production has now become transformative of the entirety of nature. we now have the ability to abolish human poverty, but it can only be done under conditions of the common ownership of all the means of production. And once that happens, says Marx, then you have the economic basis for genuine communism.
In very few places, but he tries to assess what this new world would look like once these oppressive relations are thrown off. He says there'd be little hunting in the morning, fishing at noon, raising cattle in the afternoon, and then critique after dinner. So human beings won't work long hours every day. They will be involved in spontaneous creation, and they'll feel at home as a species, as human beings create the world after themselves.
Marx, in part 2 of the manifesto, very explicitly says, we're going to abolish the family, and from now on there will be a community of women, meaning there will no woman will be with a partner. All women and all men will be a community. So you don't have a man or a woman of your own, you won't have kids of your own, you won't have anything of your own.
When you say, well, would Marx say that what's happening to the family is bad? Marx would say, no, that's a moral feeling or a moral opinion that has no bearing in my economic science.
Marx's ideas, radical as they were, found a receptive audience. This audience, however, was not the impoverished working class that he had hoped would join the revolution, but instead a well-educated and disproportionately wealthy one.
The Manifesto of the Communist Party, as it was originally called, was ultimately published in nearly all of the European languages. It certainly found an audience on the left, and it found a certain critical audience on the right as well, because the doctrine was so radical and so alarming. But the notoriety meant that Marx and his organization did attract the attention of the authorities, and eventually some of the branches were shut down. Many members of the Communist League were actually put on trial. Marx and Engels themselves had escaped to England. The irony in that supposedly Great Britain and England was at the heart of both the Industrial Revolution and global capitalism. It was also, however, politically perhaps the most tolerant regime in Europe, and so Marx himself was able to escape prosecution, unlike some of his followers. Those various prosecution cases as well against some of Marx's acolytes helped to secure the notoriety and the fame of the work, which has never since been out of print, even if it has been suppressed or censored at times. It's remained in print basically continuously ever since 1848.
Marxism tended to be most prominent among disaffected bourgeois intellectuals, so people like Marx. It had a much harder time gaining traction with the actual workers, and Marx and his successors complain about this. The workers don't understand. They need to listen to people like me.
One could certainly see an irony in Marx's rather comfortable bourgeois class origins and his advocacy of working class militancy. Marxism and communism, although they have at times had some purchase on actual members of the working class, generally speaking, the doctrines have had the most appeal to university students, college students, the comfortable, the well-off, those who really have the time to read and, of course, to process and then propagate these ideas on their own.
The working class rejected Marx's utopian vision. Their lives were improving under the capitalist system, and Marx's prediction of the proletarian revolution had not been realized. Upper-class Marxist elites, therefore, attempted to bring about the revolution themselves by violently imposing Marx's vision onto the common man.
A persistent argument is, can you have Marxism without violence? And there's a strain of argument in Marx that makes it look like the developments in economics and in society that are reflected in society that have brought about the capitalist society, if you just let that play out, you'll just sort of organically develop into a communist society. There's another strain of, in Marx's own writings, of you have to have the violent revolution, you can't do this peacefully, there will be resistance, you need terror, You need the oppressive dictatorship of the proletariat guided by the party to get rid of the old society. Partly Marx said it, and partly that's what they did. That Lenin, leading a violent revolution and immediately beginning to establish a secret police apparatus to oppress political opponents, thought he was in perfect harmony with Marx, and there's plenty of evidence in Marx to show that that's correct.
The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite.
By the late 19th century, early 20th century, Marxian ideas really seem to have become irrelevant.
Marx just wasn't that prominent in terms of the way the public perceived the socialist movement.
Socialism was changing, and Marx was being left behind.
It had been much divided by socialists who thought you don't need full communism. You don't need the revolution with the dictatorship of the proletariat and the terror. You can do reform.
Amidst the rise of progressive and gradualist socialist movements, Marxism appeared to be fading into the annals of history. But then, the war came.
Even with the power of the ideas in the manifesto, it's likely that Marxism would have failed and certainly never would have taken off in Russia without the catastrophe that was World War I.
But as the attention of the world was consolidated on the rising intensity of the First World War, few could have predicted how the war to end all wars would help to cement Marx's ideas as the foundation of one of the most brutal regimes humanity would ever experience. Before World War I, Karl Marx and his philosophy were fading into historic obscurity. That was, at least, until 1914, when the weak Russian Tsar Nicholas II caved to pressure from his advisors and made the foolish decision to enter the war.
Vladimir Ulyanov, or Lenin, as his codename was operated, was effectively the founder, if not of the Russian Marxist movement. He was certainly the originator and founder of the Bolshevik faction.
Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was a Russian man that was highly drawn in the late 19th century and the early 20th century to Marxian ideas, was very much drawn to these kind of radical socialist ideals. And he was writing all the time, developing his thought patterns. And he was quietly plotting on how to bring about socialism to Russia.
The thing that made Lenin successful is his iron will and determination.
Lenin adapted Marxism to his own purposes in the middle of World War I. When Lenin sensed the moment was ripe to seize power in November 1917, he went for it.
Despite Lenin's strategic timing, the key to communism taking root in Russia was not that the Bolshevik Party was powerful and influential. It was not that the people supported Marxist ideas. The key to Marxism taking root was the weakness of the Tsarist regime of Nicholas II.
Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Imperial Russia, was a member of the Romanov family or dynasty, which dated back ultimately to 1613. He was perhaps less well prepared than he might have been. His father, Alexander III, was seen by everyone as vigorous, extremely healthy. His illness came on quite suddenly, his death was quite unexpected, and so I think Nicholas II was both kind of shocked and a little bit unprepared when he first ascended to power. He was a devoted father and family man, and in many ways a very decent and well-minded, well-intentioned character.
When his father died suddenly in 1894, Nicholas was supposed to have said to a friend, "I don't know how to be Tsar. I don't want to be Tsar. Basically, how am I ever going to do this job?"
My dearly beloved wifey, thank you for your dear letter. It was terrible seeing you go away with the girls. Immediately went into our train, and I took him into your coupe and let him smell your pillow. And he shyly remarked that he felt sad without you. Then I kissed him and told him to go and play, promising to take him for a little walk with me at the next station. Of course, I was occupied with my beastly papers. Always yours, Nicky.
He was weak, excellent father, but in the Russian political system, he was supposed to be the father not just of his family, but of the whole country. But Nicholas was a very weak reed to vest that power in. He was 26 years old when he became Tsar, and Nicholas also never believed that he was his father's equal, and therefore never did Nicholas believe that he had the requisite strength to be the Tsar.
He didn't really have the inner self-confidence. He hesitated. In the end, I think he allowed himself often to be bullied or badgered by his advisors, such as the fateful decision to go to war in 1914, and once again to back down and abdicate in 1917. I think when push came to shove, he lacked a certain will to power.
Nicholas II was a weak ruler. And yet, even under his reign, Russia underwent rapid economic and social progress. It would require a disastrous sequence of events to uproot the growth under his rule, and eventually lead to the utter collapse of the entire regime.
Russia had been attempting to modernize, especially since about the mid-19th century. They'd made a lot of progress in that way, but there was still unhappiness with that. Not just Marxists, but any number of revolutionary groups floating around, assassinating Tsarist officials. Sort of a predecessor event that showed the fragility of the regime was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. The Russians lost. This brought out all of these tensions, and there was a revolution in 1905. Very violent, very nearly successful. It wasn't particularly a Marxist revolution, but you might say leftist in general. People wanted to get rid of the Tsar. That was narrowly repressed, and some very successful reforms. It looked like Russia was really doing well. The Tsar had probably best minister he ever had, a man named Stolypin, strengthened the Tsarist regime and did reforms that benefited people. What Stolypin said, what you can't do is go to war. That's the one thing we can't do. We have to have peace.
Russia was the economic story of the day before 1914. This colossal economic growth. The German chancellor told his son shortly before the outbreak of the First World War not to plant trees on the family estate in East Prussia, because only the Russians will benefit, he said, because the expectation was that Tsarist Russia was this kind of colossus, economic growth rates approaching 10%.
Russian economy was exploding in a good way. They were industrializing in a relatively painless way. Technology increasing greatly, but it was still fundamentally an agrarian society. About 80% of Russians were peasants.
Pyotr Stolypin, the great statesman of the decade or so before the war, was assassinated in September 1911, which was a very, very significant blow, I think, to the regime. He spoke in 1909 of what he called the need for 20 years of peace. The regime could carry out certain piecemeal social reforms and allow economic growth, eventually to create a larger class of both peasant smallholders, middle-class people with something to lose who would resist the siren song of revolution. In the end, I think the critical decision was actually made by Tsar Nicholas II when he gave the order for general mobilization, an order he initially actually rescinded. He said, "I will not be responsible for a monstrous slaughter." Unfortunately, he was badgered by his advisors all day the next day until he finally succumbed about 4 p.m. on July 30th. It was not so much the sovereigns, although they took the formal responsibility, as the military chiefs and civilian politicians who all argued some version of the same thing, that we cannot back down, that we cannot appear weak, that notions of honor and national prestige were in play. There's no telling exactly how Russia would have developed, but I don't think there's any scenario in which Lenin comes to power absent the mass slaughter of the First World War.
A few days ago, we notified the Russian people about the war Germany had declared on us. The enemy's strength increases. The both mighty German powers have taken arms against Russia and the whole Slavdom. But in double strength grows against them peaceful nations, justified anger, and with invincible fortitude raises Russia, challenged on the battlefield, against the enemy, faithfully following the glorious traditions of her past. May the Almighty God bless our weapons, and those of our allies, and may the whole Russia rise to heroic deeds in the war with iron in hand and cross in heart.
The First World War was an utter debacle for Russia long before the revolution finally tore its way through the social fabric in 1917. As early as 1915, when the Germans first made a major breakthrough on the Eastern Front, after which they proceeded to occupy much of Russian Poland and push on into the Baltic region, already then there were rumors swirling of various palace coups against the government.
The average Russian did not see the point of dying fighting, the Austro-Hungarians or Germans in the area of, say, Western Ukraine or something like that. Is what are we doing here? There wasn't a food shortage, but sometimes it wouldn't be where it needed to be, and causing dissatisfaction and things like that.
Tsar Nicholas II tried to shore up morale by taking over personal command of the armies. And in the end, the German offensive simply ran out of momentum, and the Russians were able to consolidate defensive lines.
The thing that made Marxism possible of being successful in Russia was, above all else, World War I, the catastrophic effects of that war, and the assistance of the German regime for the Bolsheviks.
Despite the unpopularity of the war, the Tsarist regime held together until 1917. However, by the beginning of that year, widespread disapproval among average citizens, dissatisfaction among the elites, and mutinies among rear echelon troops ultimately culminated in the February Revolution.
So the February Revolution took place in Russia in 1917. According to our calendar, it took place in March. It led to the collapse of the Tsarist Russian regime. Unlike the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks were not directly involved, and the Bolsheviks did not come to power in its wake.
The people who brought about the February Revolution were overwhelmingly the Russian equivalent of Western progressives. They wanted a stronger parliament, and a lot of this push came from leadership in the Russian parliament, which did not have very much power under the Tsar. They wanted it to be powerful, like the British or French parliament.
The February Revolution was, in some ways, a broader popular uprising, although in the end, the critical factor was an army mutiny which toppled the Tsarist government in Petrograd. There are certain paradoxes in the story of the Russian mutinies of 1917. To begin with, there's a huge difference between the frontline armies and the rearguard units, particularly of the Petrograd garrison. Generally speaking, whether it's the army or the navy, men who are busy, that is, they are in action, they are either fighting the enemy or preparing to go on the offensive or preparing for battle, their morale tends to hold. There might be grumbling, there might be grievances. And those armies, the ones most directly involved in the fighting in the winter of 1916-17, are preparing for spring offensives. Generally speaking, morale was fine in units in Galicia. The closer the army got to Petrograd and the northern units, to some extent the closer they were, at least later in the year, to the propaganda emanating from the Bolsheviks. But even before the February Revolution, you could see a substantial gap. It was the men who were either idle or who had less to do, or in the case of the units in Petrograd that first mutinied, the ones who were engaged in very unpopular tasks such as crowd control. That's where the mutinies tended to happen. The two critical mistakes made by the Tsarist regime, the first was simply going to war in 1914. The second mistake I think the Tsar made was abdicating. While it was true that the Tsarist authorities had lost control of the situation in Petrograd after what we now call the February Revolution, the Tsar initially ordered a punitive detachment of loyal frontline troops, the so-called St. George's Battalion, to march on the capital and to suppress the revolution by force. He was in the end once again badgered into backing down by his military advisors, and particularly his chief of staff. In the end, I think out of something like patriotic duty and self-sacrifice, he agreed to abdicate his throne on false premises, on the premise, that is, that the politicians had things under control.
In the midst of the great struggle against a foreign foe, it has pleased God to lay on Russia a new and painful trial. Newly arisen popular disturbances in the interior imperil the successful continuation of the stubborn fight. In these decisive days in the life of Russia, we deem it our duty to do what we can to help our people. For this reason, we, in agreement with the State Duma, think it best to abdicate the throne of the Russian state and to lay down the supreme power. May the Lord God help Russia.
The First Revolution overthrew the Tsar, Nicholas II, and created a provisional government.
They think, well, we've got to continue the war while loosening military discipline, because that's a Tsarist thing.
The provisional government declared absolute freedom of expression, of political activity, property rights.
This enabled the rehabilitation of a lot of political prisoners. Many of these exiles, many of whom were the most radical figures in Russian politics, were able to return to Russia in this new chaotic, freer, but also more fractious political landscape to make their mark.
The loosening of governmental regulations around political radicals allowed one such exiled radical to return: Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, who had been exiled for provoking and aiding violent revolutionary activity, seized the opportunity to return to Russia. His goal? To foment, at last, the Marxist revolution.
Lenin, sitting in Switzerland, where he'd been hanging out with like a dozen people arguing about the meaning of Marxism, is eventually helped to get back into Russia by the German regime, the Kaiser's regime. Germans, not that they wanted a Leninist regime to come into power, but they wanted the Tsarist regime to be weakened and hobbled, help Lenin and a bunch of other revolutionaries drop him off in St. Petersburg, but also with an infusion of funds to help Bolshevik propaganda. And the Germans are willing to support this because it will help them very greatly if they can get Russia out of the war.
Lenin's relationship with his German sponsors has always been controversial and remains so to this day. Certain things, however, are crystal clear. We know that Lenin was in Switzerland when the February Revolution broke out. We know that the German consul and later the German Foreign Office arranged his return trip to Russia. They paid for the entire thing. They had officials accompany him on the train as it crossed Germany. We know that there was a kind of a front company that was involved in laundering money for the Bolsheviks. We don't know all of the precise channels by which the money got to Lenin. We do know, however, both how much the Germans appropriated, again, by their own estimates, if you were to extrapolate into current currency terms, approaching something like $1 billion US.
With German financial support, Lenin was able to return to Russia under the provisional government. A failed coup in July, however, forced him back into exile as a wanted criminal. But in another stroke of historical chance, Lenin would not be out of the country for long.
The problem was the war was draining Russia of resources, draining it of manpower, and the provisional government insisted on staying in the war. So as the months progressed through the summer into the fall of 1917, there was great unrest in Russia because people were hungering for peace. Well, by early November, the provisional government was basically at the end of its tether, and Lenin moved.
The October Revolution of 1917 is the one that brought Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power. They were rebelling against the authority of what we usually call the provisional government, led by a man called Alexander Kerensky, who had lost a lot of popular support by continuing to prosecute the war, and who in particular had come to blows with certain members of the Russian officer corps, such that the army was no longer really willing to fight for him and his government.
Lenin comes back to Russia and tries to work through propaganda to get elements in the regime that are not very enthusiastic about the provisional government to join the Bolsheviks. And particularly among sailors and soldiers in the rear areas, and trying to get them to lose their loyalty to the regime.
They were able to flood the Russian armies and navies with massive amounts of propaganda, newspapers with daily print runs as high as 6 figures.
Because of the disparity in the calendars that Western Europe used and Russia used, sometimes you hear reference to an October Revolution, sometimes a November Revolution. And on the 7th of November, they staged a good old-fashioned coup d'etat.
Lenin's role in the October Revolution was certainly decisive. Lenin argued in the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party for an immediate seizure of power.
They were a minority party, a minority movement, even within socialism, even within the socialist camp in Russia. But Lenin saw the weakness of the provisional government. He saw they had no reliable support, so the Bolsheviks simply attacked. In Petrograd, Bolsheviks attacked the key communication centers, railroad stations, armories, banks, etc. They just swept in, captured these places. And when Russians woke up the next morning or a couple mornings later, the Bolsheviks were the government.
That's not to say, however, that the Bolshevik government was ever especially popular. There was a nationwide election in November 1917, and you might say this marked the peak moment of Bolshevik popularity before they had really started ruling the country. They got about 24% of the vote. Now, this was distorted somewhat by some rather impressive showings, particularly in army units, that they'd heavily propagandized. But that said, more than 3/4 of the country had voted against them.
Lenin said, in retrospect, as he looked back on it, taking power in Russia was like picking up a feather. That's how weak the provisional government was. But the Bolsheviks were not voted into power. It was a minority movement that thrust itself on a majority.
With the Bolsheviks finally in power, Lenin stood poised to implement his Marxist vision. However, a civil war broke out shortly thereafter, and Lenin's vision was tested by both external threats and internal economic difficulties.
The Bolsheviks knew we need to be in power, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to do that. Encouraging the collapse of Russian armies in the field, terror used against your political opponents, which Marx had envisioned in some of his writings as this is obviously going to be necessary, we have to do this. Lenin immediately sets up a secret police. He immediately sets up concentration camps and was always very happy from the beginning to, of course, kill people who are opposing you, and because a civil war slowly gains steam after the Bolsheviks take power, but also class enemies are not just eligible to be terrorized, it's right to terrorize them, it's good to terrorize them. And you have to have terror, Lenin says. You wrote this after the revolution. In some ways, the revolution makes capitalism stronger, and we have to be ready to use all of these methods, especially against small producers.
The smallholders, the people who owned only a parcel of land, fought side by side with the proletariat when the time came to overthrow the capitalists and the major landowners. But now our paths have diverged. Smallholders have always been afraid of discipline and organization. The time has come for us to have no mercy and to turn against them.
During the Civil War, Lenin actually, to fund the war, starts printing money like there is no tomorrow and creates hyperinflation in Russia to the point where people stop using money. Money becomes worthless. And there's a complete breakdown of a market economy. Lenin considers that a wonderful development. He thought, wow, this was easy. We didn't actually even have to try. And here we've blown through the stage of socialism, and we are now in the stage of communism where we don't need to use money anymore. The problem was that he nationalized everything, including farms. And in particular, he nationalized the Ukrainian farms. And Ukraine at that time was considered to be the breadbasket of Europe. A remarkably fertile land, and it was feeding a big chunk of Russia at that time. He nationalizes the farms, and he says to the peasants there, we want you to turn over most of what you produce, or almost all that you produce, to us, and we're going to distribute it then to all of the people of the Soviet Union.
Lenin famously said things like, well, do you guys want to talk about morality? Morality is whatever makes the revolution go forward. And so don't talk to me about it being immoral for us to kill so-called innocent people. They're not innocent. They're part of a class that is opposing night and day what the Russian Revolution is trying to do.
The international world revolution is near, although revolutions are never made to order. The imperialists will set fire to the whole world and will start a conflagration in which they themselves will perish if they dare to quell the revolution.
Lenin had high hopes for communism in the early days after the First World War. He thought that, like Russia, many of the other belligerent countries, particularly those who had been particularly badly affected by the war, had suffered the most horrendous damage, casualties, would follow Russia into revolution, and that the Communist International would immediately be able to draw on brethren governments around the world. The Comintern is an acronym or a shortening of Communist International. So this was the organization that Lenin helped to create in 1919. It was supposed to be much more rigidly controlled, where the Bolsheviks, as the senior party and the movement, the ones who had actually seized power in Russia, would effectively give orders. They laid down what were called 21 conditions of membership. All of these conditions, some of them had to do with doctrine, some of them had to do with strategy, some of them had to do with creating shadow underground governments, some of them had to do with infiltrating the military. But effectively, the upshot of all of them was that any communist party in the world, in order to call itself the Communist Party of so-and-so country, would have to obey instructions from Moscow.
Lenin was optimistic that communism would spread to the Western world. Yet, at home, he was confronted with the harsh consequences of his domestic policies in Russia.
By nationalizing private property, industry, by confiscating private bank accounts. This led to the mass shuttering of factories, mass unemployment. By trying to ration and effectively confiscate food from peasants from the countryside, they caused many peasants to either stop growing or to hide food. All this eventually produced catastrophic conditions approaching famine across much of the country by the winter of 1920-21.
There were contemporary accounts that people were so desperate, there was despair, that they actually were engaging in cannibalism. And there were documented cases of people, in fact, eating their own children. It was that horrific. That's the situation that Lenin was looking at in 1920, 1921, where he came to realize that what they were doing was not working. The country had totally collapsed.
About 1.3 or 1.4 million Russians had died in World War I. In the next 3.5, 4 years, 25 million Russians would die in the Civil War, in the peasant rebellions, which then kind of separate from the fighting in the armies, and in the famine brought about by the war. So 18 times the number of Russians that died in a very bloody, demoralizing World War I. So mass death, brutality, upheaval, the impoverishment of not just ordinary Russians, but Russia. Before this period was over, so by the early 1920s, the war on the churches had begun, which was an integral part of Russian society, so stripping them of their property, in some cases sending the priests and bishops to camps, or even ordinary believers if they resisted. So social transformation too, and sort of social chaos in addition to outright murder and mayhem.
Comrades, the Kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. The interests of the whole revolution demand such actions. You must make an example of these people. 1. Hang. I mean hang publicly, so that people see it. At least 100 kulaks, rich bastards, and known bloodsuckers. 2. Publish their names. 3. Seize all their grain. 4. Single out the hostages. Do all this so that for miles around, people see it all, understand it, tremble. Reply, saying you have received and carried out these instructions. Yours, Lenin.
A great example of Leninist brutality was how he dealt with the Kronstadt Rebellion, which was sailors who had become disaffected by Bolshevik rule, brutally smashed by military force, the ringleaders all shot, and everyone else shipped off to concentration camps. And what's really striking about this is that they had initially helped in the revolution. They were revolutionaries. It kind of epitomizes the ruthlessness of Lenin.
Kronstadt had furnished a lot of the foot soldiers of the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917. A lot of the Red Guards came from there because there were naval and army units there. There were a lot of mutineers there. And so because it came from this origin point for so much of where the Bolsheviks had relied on for their popular and armed support and muscle in 1917. It was a kind of stain on the reputation of the regime. By 1921, although the Bolsheviks had seen off their military opponents and were starting to round up some of the last peasant rebels, the economy had utterly collapsed.
The food crisis has gone from bad to worse, and the working masses are starving. They no longer have the physical strength necessary to continue working. The workers are desperate and ready to take any measures necessary, unless some sort of solution to these problems is found immediately.
So he ushered in what he labeled the new economic policy in 1921, which was a reintroduction of markets. He said, in order to be able to take 2 steps forward in the future, we need to take 1 step back.
Now, Lenin himself, stubborn in many ways, he didn't exactly admit fault or responsibility, but tacitly he did. The so-called new economic policy brought back, in a lot of ways, private enterprise, the buying and selling of grain, eventually small-scale retail and manufacturing and all the rest.
The government would retain control over the commanding heights of the economy: manufacturing, heavy industry, transport, finance, international trade, but that there would be allowance made for individual ownership.
These capitalists that started their businesses under new economic policy, some of them became quite successful, and they ended up being referred to as a put down, as NEP-men, NEP, new economic policy, so NEP-men.
The way they tried to rationalize it was that communists were inexperienced and they didn't know how to run a business and they didn't know how to run an economy. And so they would hire experts and allow private businessmen to teach communists how to run businesses and how to run an economy.
But even the Bolsheviks' new economic policy, with its partial privatization of many industries, was not enough to sustain Lenin's communist experiment. Perhaps one of history's greatest ironies and tragedies is that the leading nations of the West were largely responsible for the survival of the communist system in Russia.
The reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution on the part of the West is very disappointing. The Bolsheviks, they take over, they do this vast damage. The country is economically ruined. They were saved by Western intervention. The real Western intervention that was decisive was to fundamentally not help the white armies that were trying to defeat the Bolsheviks, and in some cases undermining them. The English recognized the Soviet Union relatively quickly, opening them up for loans and things like that. And in the midst of their famine, America provided a massive amount of free food with good intentions to relieve human suffering. But what it also meant was the regime was able to survive, which it might not otherwise have been able to do.
They actually hired, among other people, Herbert Hoover, head of the American Relief Administration, to try to alleviate mass starvation in 1921.
Under Herbert Hoover is feeding 10 million Russians.
The food had simply stopped showing up in the cities. There was mass starvation. Even Pravda, Soviet propaganda organ, admitted that as many as 33 million people were at risk of starvation by 1921. The population of Moscow and Petrograd had declined by as much as 60 or 70%. To give you a figure of comparison, Petrograd, the population had dropped from maybe 2.5 million to perhaps about 650 or 700,000.
Lenin did not really have, at any point, a very good idea of what the economy should look like. He really did have a kind of a naive expectation that things would just sort of take care of themselves, and that it would not be a need for this centrally planned economy. That was not part of his thinking. Certainly was not something that he attempted to implement. That came with Stalin in 1928.
One of the most interesting dysfunctionalities of the communist regime in Russia, created by Lenin, was There was never a systematic process for transfer of power.
It wasn't obvious when Lenin died, do you have to have another Lenin who's really the leader in charge, no one else being able to thwart his will?
In the absence of a succession plan, Lenin's death meant that the next leader of the Soviet Union would consolidate power through brutal force, a brutality that would define the Soviet Union through World War II and into the Cold War. That leader was Joseph Stalin.
At home, Stalin plots to get rid of his opposition. He confides to his friends to choose the victim, to prepare the blow with care, to satisfy an implacable vengeance and then go to bed. There is nothing sweeter in the world. On the right is Sergei Kirov. Stalin uses the assassination of Kirov as the excuse for the executions that claim thousands of lives. The first to go, Stalin's former associates. Zinoviev, executed. Kamenev, executed. Radek, executed. Pyatakov, executed.
Stalin's power particularly was the most power wielded by any leader in the 20th century. Really unchecked. No one in the Soviet Union could tell him no.
Stalin took very seriously the idea that socialism needs to transform human nature, and any leftovers of self-interest need to be cleansed out of human nature. Absolute brutality, killing of women, children. Anybody that was not willing to do what they needed to do to carry out their role in this new socialist economy would be dispensed with.
The issue of who was going to run the country was an issue that the Communist Party needed to sort out. Now, Lenin had one stroke in 1922, an even more debilitating stroke in 1923, which robbed him of the power of speech. He died in 1924.
Stalin, birth name actually Djugashvili, was Georgian by origin. So he grew up in the Tsarist Empire, in a part of the Tsarist Empire with a certain tradition of national peculiarity. In the case of Georgia, a little bit of maybe resentment of Russian dominance, and also an interesting tradition, you might say, of a kind of culture of the vendetta, which I think Stalin definitely absorbed. Despite his later reputation for being something of a thug or a strongman, Stalin was actually an intellectual. He actually dabbled in poetry. He was a good writer. He was an impressive theoretician. He was absolutely a Marxist, an intellectual, someone who took ideas seriously, who took doctrine seriously, who came to the attention of many of the leaders of the Russian Marxist, later Bolshevik party, such as Lenin.
I first became acquainted with Lenin in 1903. It was not a personal acquaintance, but was by correspondence. It made an indelible impression upon me, one which has never left me throughout all my work in the party. My knowledge of Lenin's revolutionary activities had convinced me that in Lenin we had a man of extraordinary caliber.
He had a darker side as well. He was almost certainly involved in a series of robberies, most famously this kind of spectacular heist carried out in broad daylight of an armored car. And this too won Lenin's attention and admiration.
Stalin was a sort of leading lieutenant of Lenin during the revolution, longtime Russian revolutionary. What wasn't obvious was in 1917 that Stalin would be Lenin's successor. And during the Civil War, I think, was really when Stalin rose to, in Lenin's mind, to be sort of obvious candidate to be the next leader of the party and hence his replacement.
The fact of the matter is, Lenin liked Stalin, and he saw to it that Stalin was chosen by the Communist Party apparatus in 1922 to a very high position of authority, General Secretary.
Despite Lenin's initial favor towards Stalin, he grew suspicious of the rising star in the Communist Party, culminating in a letter of warning to the Communist Congress.
Stalin is too rude, and this defect, although quite tolerable in our midst and in dealing among us communists, becomes intolerable in a Secretary General. That is why I suggest that the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post and appointing another man in his stead.
So Lenin died in 1924 and had been sick for several years and increasingly unable to do much work. And Stalin kept rising to prominence in that time. Stalin was a great bureaucrat. He had a killer work ethic and was always willing to grind away at his desk. And a lot of what he was doing was accumulating power for himself and for people loyal to him.
Lenin's wishes were disregarded. Stalin remained General Secretary of the Communist Party and was positioned to consolidate power. But he would have to navigate competing factions seeking to undermine his power in the years following Lenin's death.
Over quite a long period of time, probably not until 1938, so about 15 years, Stalin has to navigate and purge. And so the Great Purge is the sort of the coping stone, dated like 1936 to 38, of anybody who was prominent before Stalin. Maybe anybody would be an exaggeration, but not by much.
People like Zinoviev, who was the leader of the Comintern. There were other moderates, at least when it came to the forced collectivization that Lenin was pursuing. Lev Kamenev and Bukharin. By the end of the 1930s, all those guys had been liquidated.
A lot of old Civil War heroes, a lot of people who had been around Lenin when he came back. That was preceded by waves of purges of other people, all aimed at solidifying Stalin's rule and Soviet power.
Leon Trotsky, who was Stalin's major competition, had led the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, was exiled, had to leave Russia in 1929.
As he's consolidating power, he decides that new economic policy has to end. So he actually expropriates all of the NEP-men, as they were called, NEP, NEP-men, these capitalists. And he takes all of their property, ends up, in fact, imprisoning most of them, executing many of them, and institutes full-blown system of central economic planning.
In 1928, he decreed the first 5-year plan, which went all out for mass collectivization of agriculture, and the capital that the government gained from that, they applied to the building of heavy industry as quickly as possible.
Two of the most prominent things Stalin did before World War II were the economic plans and industrialization and collectivization. Industrialization was meant to cement Stalin's control, but also to produce, especially for war, and in that way massively successful in consolidating the regime and in armament factories dwarfing anything outside of the United States, the capacity to produce armaments at the time.
They simply took over all of the small businesses, so there was no opportunity for people to not work. That was not an option for men and women of the Soviet Union. If they did not want to work, they would be executed. They all had to work, and they were all assigned work. They were told where to go and work.
This control of every facet of the economy required Stalin to develop new ways of managing every person under him. In response to this dilemma, Stalin's regime attempted to apply the management structure of private Western businesses to the entire nation and all 150 million people living in the Soviet Union.
That 5-year plan system necessitated basically Stalin saying, here are the overall goals that I would like the economy to achieve. I want there to be more focus on industrialization and production of steel. And then there was the institution by the name of Gosplan. Gosplan was the central planning board of the Soviet Union. Gosplan would then have the responsibility to come up with a fairly detailed plan for the production of the entire economy. And then they would send that plan kind of down the hierarchy, and they would say, here's what we expect you to do. Are you able to do that? The management would say, there's no way we can do that. Or, we can do that, but we're going to need more resources to be able to accomplish that. And then once it got to the bottom, to the actual line workers and things like that, it would start making its way back up the hierarchy with more feedback provided until it reached back to Gosplan. And Gosplan would then present it to Stalin. Stalin would sign off for it, and it would become what came to be known as Plan Law. And then subsequently, there would be the implementation of that plan law, and they would have to stick to that plan for the next 5 years, come hell or high water. And that's what the Soviet Union did for the subsequent 63 years.
A record of overstaffing, overplanning, and complete incompetence at the center, of human misery, starvation, death and disease among the peasantry. The only creatures who have any life at all in the districts visited are boars, pigs, and other swine. Men, women, and children, horses and other workers are left to die in order that the 5-year plan shall at least succeed on paper.
The repression under Stalin began almost immediately with the launching of the first 5-year plan and the collectivization drive, which began in 1928 and 1929.
Stalin's focus was entirely on the economic structure of the country. The political structure of the country was established. It was very easy. He was in charge. He had absolute power.
There were a series of show trials of so-called wreckers, or of these groups who were kind of scapegoated or blamed for anything that would go wrong with the industrialization drive. So there was a kind of mass terror, mass arrests, which began very early on.
Moscow show trials were a series of trials, especially of leading people in the party, as part of the Great Purge, meant to show, I think, Stalin's power. These people on the most ridiculous charges were supposed to accuse themselves and confess in front of everybody, hence the show trial. I mean, they weren't real trials. They weren't trying to prove something. The result was predetermined. But the key element was literally managed by Stalin himself in a sort of theatrical way, in public, in front of the press and Western press, and then have that reported all over the world.
The few foreign journalists and diplomats permitted to attend the trial were puzzled and astonished at the manner in which the defendants denounced themselves and Trotsky and dragged in the names of other prominent Soviet leaders who in the past have been opposed to Stalin. The prisoners testified as they did with the hope of escaping torture or obtaining commutation of sentence or from fear that failure so to testify would result in harm to members of their families or friends.
Stalin very much thought of himself as the vanguard of the proletariat. He thought he was the physical embodiment of the proletariat, and therefore whatever he decided should be done, because he had absolute confidence that what he was doing would be the right thing for the working classes. And we have very little evidence that he ever had any doubts in the means that he was using to achieve the ends that he was after.
Stalin absolutely went full bore with the communist offensive. Full central planning, full state control of agriculture, all of this absolutely part of the Marxist tradition. Of course, it wasn't perfect in practice. They didn't really have enough tractors to mechanize all of agriculture. They had to import a lot of foreign equipment. They had to hire a lot of foreign capitalists. There was a pragmatic side to Stalinism. There always was. Even the kolkhoz, or the collective farm, one of the most famous institutions of Soviet communism of the Stalin era, was actually modeled on an American capitalist operation run by the Wheat King of Montana, as he was known popularly. There were illicit levels to this as well. There was a Soviet espionage, an industrial espionage campaign, a whole team of spies that penetrated the American aviation industry in the 1930s. There were other teams that were studying things like armaments production, tanks and tractors. And this is a very conscious policy on the Soviet part, a policy of industrial espionage.
Stalin's collectivization and industrialization transformed the Soviet economy. It built factories, technologies, and machines at a rapid pace. However, brutal Soviet methods were not without massive human suffering. Suffering struck the farmers of Ukraine especially hard. They would pay the greatest price for Stalin's economic successes.
Stalin did what Lenin was not willing to do, able to do, which is crack down so much on the peasants. Any peasants that were not working to seemingly their maximum abilities, they would be hauled away, stuck in a concentration camp, starved to death.
Led to horrible famine. Killed many people were killed in the process of forcing them onto the farms, or starved afterwards.
The Great Famine in the Ukraine in 1932-33 came at the tail end of the first five-year plan, but it has to do with the fact that the peasants were resisting the government coming in and stealing their land. And the first group of peasants that Stalin targeted for mass liquidation were called the kulaks.
They sent hundreds of thousands of farmers, so-called kulaks, that is the successful farmers. Actually, that's what the kulaks were. So they were, the ones who had a brick house on their farm. You're a kulak, you're gone.
Grain was famously exported at the height of the famine, showing utter callous disregard for the welfare of these Ukrainians. Horrific suffering. We know about reports from the era of cannibalism.
This is called Holodomor. Nobody knows exactly how many Ukrainian peasants were killed.
Rumors began circulating in the village that in one family the parents of a little boy had killed and eaten him. I began to be afraid of my mother, and I would cry. One day my mother asked me why I was crying. "You wanted me?" Then she began to cry and calmed me down. A 12-year-old girl, an acquaintance of mine, died in a nearby house. Her mother cut up her corpse put the pieces on a plate and ate them. Entire families were dying after being poisoned by copper sulfate, which the authorities has sprinkled into the bags of seed grain to prevent people from eating it.
It's been realized. And I believe sincerely that the most impelling motive that has lain behind the conversations which were successfully concluded yesterday between Russia and the United States was the desire of both countries for peace, the desire for the strengthening of the peaceful purpose of the civilized world.
Why doesn't this Soviet genocide get the same sort of response from the West as, say, the Holocaust of Nazi Germany?
There's a massive disparity in the amount of coverage between the Holocaust perpetrated by Nazi Germany and Soviet terror and tyranny.
What subhumans did these things? At Belsen, we caught the camp commander, Joseph Kramer.
No one can seriously doubt the common use of corrective labor camps, the mass casualties, the terror of whole populations. The Soviets also did terror based on ethnic profiling, you might say. Baltic Germans, Koreans, Chechens, mostly class enemies, following Marxist theory. And the only thing I can think of to account for the difference in treatment is Western elites are often sympathetic to communism.
You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, and the Bolshevist leaders are just as indifferent to the casualties that may be involved in their drive towards socialization as any general during the World War who ordered a costly attack in order to show his superiors that he and his division possessed the proper soldierly spirit. In short, conditions are definitely bad in certain sections, but there is no famine.
I think one of the incidents that shows that Stalin was a stupid ideologue, let me put it bluntly, that he was not just a clever guy, who used Marxism to get power. He actually believed in it. And that was, he believed that Soviet engineers were deliberately sabotaging his plans. And so they had all these engineers trials. But the engineers, these were basically people who were trying to figure things out in the context of a chaotic economy run by government bureaucrats who were ignorant mostly of how to produce anything. Stalin misunderstood. He thought these people were like suffused with bourgeois morality and therefore secretly working against the government. So he had them arrested, and many of them were sent off to the Gulag Archipelago, and they basically destroyed a large quantity of the people who were building Russia, who were building the Soviet economy. He had done all kinds of stuff to wreck the Soviet economy, unintentionally, because he thought, we've got to follow Lenin. Lenin says you got to purge everybody who's suspicious. So send them off to the camps. And in each case, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people would be sent off into the camps to work, often to die because they weren't fed enough, really, to live a healthy life.
His legacy, most importantly, is one of brutality. He killed something like 15 to 20 million civilians. All of those civilians were killed because they stood in the way of progress from reaching the final stage of history, that communist stage of history. The brutality was just unimaginable.
Trotsky had moved to Mexico, and he was murdered there by an associate that he had taken into his entourage. In fact, this young man was a Stalin agent. That was in 1940.
The Soviet military was weakened when war started because a lot of their senior leadership had been killed and replaced with people without nearly as much experience. But Stalin's power was solidified. In that way, it made the Soviet Union stronger.
The outbreak of World War II did not merely correspond with a new peak of Stalin's consolidated power. It also signaled an opportunity that Stalin was keen to capitalize upon.
Then Hitler invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, and in 1939, Poland. First step on the road to Russia. But his eastward march was interrupted by France and Britain declaring war. So the Germans were forced to turn west. And in 1940, as we have seen, wiped the last opposition from Western Europe. And while the Nazis were unsuccessfully trying to beat Britain to her knees, the German generals were already planning to resume the interrupted Eastern Blitz. The road to Russia was now open.
Well, I suppose by Stalin's war, in the first sense, I mean that the Second World War was Stalin's victory. Even if the United States might have emerged in a strong position, that Stalin was the primary victor in terms of the spoils. If you simply look at the expansion of the Soviet Empire, Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe and Northern Asia, and then eventually even linking up with Mao's armies and leading to the triumph of the communists in the Chinese Civil War, that it's Stalin's victory. But there's a broader sense in which Stalin's war was a design, or at least a result, of Stalin's own diplomatic and strategic maneuvering. That is to say, particularly the war that broke out in Europe in 1939 was not a war that anyone in Europe particularly wanted. We might think it's the war Hitler wanted. Hitler is the one, after all, who invaded Poland in September 1939. However, Hitler had not expected or hoped that Britain and France would declare war. In fact, he thought because they had gone along with him regarding the Sudetenland being absorbed into the German Reich, he did not think Britain and France would fight. Now, it was not necessarily the war that either Britain or France wanted, judging by the fact that they did very little to contest it at first. In fact, they did almost nothing to help Poland. To some extent, Poland was rather a cause, or at least an excuse, for them to go to war with Germany rather than something they actually wanted to fight for. It was, however, precisely the war that Stalin wanted, that is, a war of attrition between the capitalist powers. And there's a long line of discussion of this going back to Lenin's time about Soviet foreign policy.
A war is on between two groups of capitalist countries for the redivision of the world, for the domination of the world. We see nothing wrong in their having a good, hard fight and weakening each other. It would be fine if at the hands of Germany, the position of the richest capitalist countries, especially England, were shaken. Hitler, without understanding or desiring it, is shaking and undermining the capitalist system. We can maneuver, pit one side against the other to set them fighting with each other as fiercely as possible.
Europe would be consumed by war. It would be another horrific war of attrition, which would bog down Germany and the Western powers, and eventually the Red Armies that Stalin had really been mobilizing and building for the past decade and a half would eventually swoop in and kind of inherit the ruins.
Despite the perception that the Soviet Union was a strong Western ally and military power by the end of the war, the grim reality was that the Soviet Union was barely holding on to its own survival, and indeed was only afloat because of American aid.
The quantity of aid that the United States was sending to the Soviet Union during the war was so massive that it's really a question as to whether there would have even been a serious post-war Soviet Union without that aid. They had been so devastated during the war, and plus Stalin in the 1930s had so wrecked his own system of economic production, that without the American buildup and sending them the latest technology and the latest patents and all that, it would have been really hard for the Soviets to be able to be a world power on par with the U.S.
The victorious side in the Second World War, the principal members of the so-called Grand Alliance, were the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. You've got the world's largest capitalist country, the world's largest imperialist country, and the world's largest communist country, all fighting on the same side. But if there was anything that communism stood against, it was capitalism and imperialism. Yet, these three powers fought and won the European War in World War II. Once the common enemy of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime, once that was eliminated, I think it was perfectly natural to expect the alliance to break up. And it did.
The city of Yalta in the Crimea is the meeting place of the leaders of Britain, Russia, and the United States.
The Yalta Conference was held in February 1945. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt all signed a declaration on liberated Europe. The essence of that held that the liberated countries would have the freedom to restore governments of their own choosing. The Cold War developed out of Stalin's reneging on his commitment, because he never permitted there to be free elections in the countries in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and Albania, and Czechoslovakia, and ultimately East Germany as well. By 1947, 1948, the communist parties in every one of those Eastern European countries had taken power.
We have no choice except to build up our defenses. The world.
So a year and a half or two after the war, Truman and his staffers are beginning to notice, all these deals that we made with the Soviets during the war, they're not living up to, many of them. And Truman didn't go along with that. And he and his people decided, in fact, we're now becoming afraid of the Soviet Union because they seem to want to keep expanding.
So much mistrust had developed out of that inevitably we get the Cold War.
A shadow had fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive and proselytizing tendencies. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. Whatever conclusions may be drawn.
The Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946, which Mr. Churchill delivered while he was out of power, of course, it was a rallying cry, I think, for the West to identify the problem, see the problem of Soviet expansion for what it really was, and to take a stand against it.
Orthodox Marxism, the proletarian revolution was going to be spontaneous or close to spontaneous in all the advanced countries of the world, basically Europe, and that didn't happen. And so then there was a fight in the 1920s, well, what are we going to do? Because it's only succeeded in one country. The big turning point was the aftermath of World War II, when, because of the way the war was settled with very favorable terms for the Soviet Union, Soviet armies were in other places, especially most famously in Eastern Europe, but also in the Far East. The ending of the war had greatly advantaged the Soviets, and they were able to aid the communists in China in taking over China, kind of breaking out of the socialism in one country model towards the end of Stalin's life.
As communism began to spread after World War II throughout Europe and Asia, the Western world grew increasingly concerned. By wily political maneuvers, Stalin leveraged the war to position the Soviet Union as a leader in the New World Order and to exert control over the weaker nations of Eastern Europe and Asia.
Some of the horrors we later associate with Stalinism began very early on in Stalin's reign. A lot of the history of it was actually known at the time. Perhaps not well known in the West, but it was well known inside the Soviet Union and even talked about by Soviet leaders who talked about it as it was happening.
Toward the end of Stalin's life, even as the West began to become more vocal in its concern about the spread of communism, most citizens of the West were unaware of the brutality that lay beneath the growing sense of unease. It wouldn't be until decades later, after the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's writings, that the full scope of the horrors of Stalin's reign would come to light and shock the conscience of the Western world.
Stalin died in the spring of 1953. Opinion in the United States toward Stalin, toward Soviet Russia, of course, had been deeply affected by the fact that we were comrades in arms.
As the Second World War ended, the fragile alliance between the USSR and the United States was shattered. The war against the Germans had provided a temporary source of unity between the powers, but after Berlin fell, the fundamental contradictions of their political systems came to the fore.
And communist outposts throughout much of the world. What is the secret of communism's post-war expansion?
The testimonies of Soviet citizens began to spread through the West, further inflaming animosity between the former allies.
It wasn't until much later, decades after Stalin's passing, that we found out about the full extent of Stalin's brutality, how horrible he was, how many people he actually killed, how many people he sent off to die in the gulags.
One of the best ways to understand the practice and theory of life in the Soviet Union is through reading the works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who became famous as a dissident, and especially when his 3-volume work, The Gulag Archipelago, appeared in the 1970s.
We didn't know anything about the gulags until Solzhenitsyn started writing about it. So it wasn't until decades after Stalin's passing that the Western world fully discovered the extent of Stalin's brutality.
The Gulag system was the enormous Soviet concentration camp corrective labor system begun by Lenin and perfected and expanded by Stalin. The aim of the Gulag was, above all else, through corrective labor, make the new Soviet man out of people who were deemed to be otherwise unreliable. All of Soviet society was affected by the Gulag. Millions and millions of Russians went through it, and so even if you were never in it, you undoubtedly had family or friends who were.
Stalin took very seriously the idea that socialism needs to transform human nature. And any leftovers of self-interest need to be cleansed out of human nature.
These people, who had experienced on their own hides 24 years of communist happiness, knew by 1941 what as yet no one else in the world knew, that nowhere on the planet, nowhere in history, was there a regime more vicious, more bloodthirsty, and at the same time more cunning and ingenious than the Bolshevik, the self-styled Soviet regime. That no other regime on earth could compare with it, either in the number of those it had done to death, in hardiness, in the range of its ambitions, in its thoroughgoing and unmitigated totalitarianism.
Solzhenitsyn was born in the year of the revolution and was a convinced Marxist. Like most of his peers, had been educated towards belief in Marxism and the goodness of the Soviet Union. And the shattering experience that took him out of that was his arrest while fighting in World War II. And the story behind this is very revealing. He's at the front. He's an artillery battery commander, in this very precarious situation, and was literally arrested by Soviet counterintelligence in the middle of a battle because he had made a joke in a letter about the man with the mustache, you might say, meaning Stalin. The censors picked up on it and had him plucked out in the middle of a battle, and beginning this process, which he describes especially in the Gulag Archipelago, of dehumanization and terror.
Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, he begins with a history of our sewage disposal system. And you think about what that means. Literally, it is that the Soviet regime is consuming its own people and flushing them down the sewage line.
The grueling labor in harsh conditions was preceded by a series of events for your typical prisoner. The first being arrest, followed by interrogation, which probably next to the actual experience of the camp be the worst part of this whole process for the typical person, often involving torture, which could be anything from beatings to sleep deprivation. The goal being to get you to confess to whatever you'd been accused of. And so it wasn't just the breaking of your body through labor later, it's the breaking of your spirit by having to confess to things most likely you'd not done, overwhelmingly.
Solzhenitsyn argues that the Gulag system was meant to be, in its way, educational of the public, right? We are going to teach you what it means to be a Soviet person, completely dedicated to this wonderful future that's coming, but requires now a lot of sacrifice and hard work.
The core experience in Gulag is the brutal work in horrifying conditions with inadequate food. And so every camp you'd have a norm set, how much you have to produce to get the bare minimum of food to live. And it could be breaking a certain amount of rock, or cutting down a certain amount of trees, or mining a certain amount of ore. This, dehumanizing and often deadly, very high death rate in these camps just from being worked to death. Tiny amounts of food, very low caloric intake of very poor quality food, coupled with very harsh breaking rocks for 10 hours, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Solzhenitsyn's experience in the corrective labor camps is one of going from being a believing Marxist when he's arrested to understanding the brutal and inhumane character of Marxist theory and Soviet practice.
We were made to strip naked, and were shoved into some roofless enclosures made out of planks. Above our heads the stars twinkled. Below our bare feet lay frozen excrement. An enclosure measured 3 square feet. Each held 3 to 4 naked, shivering, and frightened men and women. Then these kennel cages were opened, one after the other, and the naked people were led across the courtyard into a special building where our documents were formulated and our things were searched. The goal of this search was to leave us with rags and to take the good things for themselves. Then thieves shamelessly fleeced these destitute and barely alive people.
There was an academic element and a sentiment among the intellectual elite in the late 1940s that was skeptical of the whole idea that we couldn't get along with the Russians, that they posed some kind of threat to us. And there was a lot of sympathy toward the whole communist ideal.
That is Russia. Size, the largest country in the world.
Even after the Cold War started and the containment policy became U.S. policy in a broad way, there was still a lot of sympathy in the West, in American leadership positions, in academia, in the media, for socialism.
Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago exposed the West for the first time to the lived reality, I think, of the Soviet camps. The fact that, in fact, this was a huge part of life in the Soviet Union, involving millions of people. That it was not just an accidental byproduct, but was to some extent a central part of the Soviet political and economic landscape.
Many people in the West who had been sympathetic to communism could no longer have that sympathy after reading Solzhenitsyn's depiction of Stalinist tyranny.
Each time they brought in the soup, it made us all want to cry. We were ready to cry for fear that the soup would be thin. And when a miracle occurred and the soup was thick, we couldn't believe it and ate it as slowly as possible. But even with thick soup in a warm stomach, there remained a sucking pain. We'd been hungry for too long. All human emotions, love, friendship, envy, concern for one's fellow man, compassion, longing for fame, honesty, had left us with a flesh that had melted from our bodies.
In Solzhenitsyn's writings, you can look at the theory of Marx, but what it results in practice is something very different. And this comes out in various writings of Solzhenitsyn. When he looked at what the Soviet Union really was, it was a war of a particular kind of political order against the Russian people.
I think of Solzhenitsyn as being important because he provided the most memorable account of the whole Soviet prison system and its size, its massive, huge, its character. He was trying to show that this horrific prison system, through which hundreds of thousands, probably several million people died of overwork and of starvation. Right? So in that prison system was not an accidental feature at all of the Soviet system, but rather essential to the Soviet system. And why? Because that goes back to Marx. The idea that in order to bring about the revolution, you have to be absolutely ruthless against its opponents. Marx and Lenin, that was their argument. Party discipline and crush the workers if they oppose you. And what that idea of history or of politics leads to is war between government and the public.
This system either causes you to lose your humanity or to ascend, because ascent or corruption, those are your choices. The dividing line is, in Solzhenitsyn's account, will you do anything to survive, or are there things you won't do because they're wrong? If you'll take a stand on principle, even at the risk of your life, you can ascend. If you'll steal that little bit of bread from the person starving because they're weaker than you, you're descending. but you can ascend if you refuse to cooperate with the regime, even if it means being sent off to a labor camp where you'll most likely die.
And as soon as you have renounced that aim of surviving at any price and gone where the calm and simple people go, then imprisonment begins to transform your former character in an astonishing way. The stones rustle beneath our feet. We are ascending.
The Gulag Archipelago did not achieve its goal of creating socialist man. Solzhenitsyn believed that the kind of socialism that they instituted in the Soviet Union, it was a failure, and it has to be a failure, and it always will be. Because the goal itself, which is the complete abolition of human self-interest, is completely at odds with human nature. And it will always require, at some point, violence or tacit abandonment in order for it to survive.
Looking back, I saw that for my whole conscious life, I had not understood either myself or my strivings. But just as the waves of the sea knock the inexperienced swimmer off his feet and keep tossing him back onto the shore, so also was I painfully tossed back on dry land by the blows of misfortune. And it was only because of this that I was able to travel the path which I had always really wanted to travel. It was granted me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back this essential experience: how a human being becomes evil and how good. And that is why I turn back to the years of my imprisonment and say, sometimes to the astonishment of those about me, "Bless you, prison."
The personal stories of people like Solzhenitsyn, he's not the only one, but he's probably the most famous. But he and others like him had a great impact in putting a human face on these doctrines, where people might say, well, wouldn't it be nice to have a classless society? I mean, maybe we don't want to do that in America, but their goal is basically good, and we should be sympathetic to it. Solzhenitsyn and others writing about Soviet tyranny really showed people what it was like. This is destroying the lives of people you could identify with. It was very powerful in undermining sympathy for the USSR and its allies in the West.
There were writings that elements of the American intellectual community began to look at and think about more seriously, that pointed out the utter failings of communism and really its unworkability as an economic system, but also its brutality as a political system. As these things became more and more known as the 40s led into the 50s and beyond, American opinion more and more, I think, assumed the kind of footing that was suitable to taking a staunch stand against the Soviet Union in the early stages of the Cold War.
As the writings of Solzhenitsyn and others tore the veil off the conduct of the Soviet regime, exposing the horrors of its practices, two economists reveal the utter futility of its economic theory.
Most proponents of socialism, they initially were actually very supportive of the Soviet experiment. Most of them jumped off board once they started finding out about the level of atrocities that were committed by Stalin. It was hard to find defenders of Stalin by certainly the late 40s, early 50s. And that's where you start seeing the emergence of competing theories of socialism. Socialists, especially in the Western world, start losing faith in the Soviet model and what the Soviet Union is doing, and they start adhering to alternative versions of socialism. There is one man that, in fact, starts pushing back quite strongly, and that is the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. He becomes the most notable voice to start pushing back against those intellectual currents. Mises writes an article in 1920 called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, critiquing socialism, the socialist model of the economy, which was based on government ownership of the means of production, that was doomed to failure. The way he put it is that rational economic calculation under socialism was impossible.
The problem of economic calculation is the fundamental problem of socialism. To prove that economic calculation would be impossible in the socialist community is to prove also that socialism is impracticable. Everything brought forward in favor of socialism during the last 100 years, in thousands of writings and speeches, all the blood which has been spilled by the supporters of socialism cannot make socialism workable. The masses may long for it ever so ardently. Innumerable revolutions and wars may be fought for it. Still, it will never be realized.
All thinkers influenced by Marx, pretty much all socialists, believe that if you get rid of that need to make a profit by putting the means of production into the hands of the government, scarcity disappears. Mises points out that scarcity is unavoidable, and therefore that socialists are not going to be able to deal with that scarcity for one fundamental reason. Without private property rights in resources, it is impossible to have market prices. And in the absence of market prices, people have no idea what the relative scarcities of those capital goods are. So the only thing they can resort to is totally arbitrary uses of those scarce capital goods. We just think people want more of this, and they don't want more of that. But they have no way of knowing whether it's actually something that people want or do not want. As a result of Mises' argument here, he came to the conclusion that this newly emergent socialist country, socialist economy, the first one, he makes a very bold and very certain prediction that there's absolutely no way that Soviet Union will be able to engage in rational economic calculation, and they're going to therefore end up suffering from massive inefficiencies. They will waste all of the available physical capital that they have access to. They will not be able to rebuild most of the physical capital, and economic collapse is the only possible end. Store shelves were usually empty. There was pretty much no variety of any kind of products. Exactly what Mises said would happen is what we started seeing happening in the Soviet Union.
Socialism is not in the least what it pretends to be. It is not the pioneer of a better and finer world, but the spoiler of what thousands of years of civilization have created. It does not build, it destroys. For destruction is the essence of it. It produces nothing. It only consumes what the social order based on private ownership of the means of production has created.
Friedrich Hayek has emerged as Mises' most prominent student. Hayek was greatly influenced by Mises. He was 18 years Mises' junior. It was hearing Mises that turned Hayek from being a socialist into being a proponent of liberty and free markets. When he became a student at University of Vienna, it was actually hearing Mises that completely changed how he looked at the world.
Libertarian economists like von Mises, like Friedrich Hayek, had a great deal of influence, especially in the post-World War II era, when the Cold War began, in showing people how economically socialist economics, Marxist economics doesn't make sense and can only be destructive of genuine prosperity and liberty.
What Hayek sets out to do is to more fully flesh out Mises' argument. The claim that these economists were making is that it is no longer necessary to have private ownership of the means of production because we have access to various kinds of mathematical economic models and statistical techniques through which we can simply estimate what those prices would have been. Hayek says it is impossible to collect all of the data that you would need to have and then to make the kinds of calculations that you would need to give you the same kind of information that you get from market prices, which after all are the result of the interactions of millions of people. The only way we know what ought to be done in markets is because we have this continuous market process of competition where entrepreneurs are in continuous state of rivalry against one another, trying to outdo one another by doing something better, by appealing to their customers more effectively. He writes about all examples of socialism that inevitably, if you do not have the possibility of private ownership of capital, it is impossible to have liberty.
The recognition of private property is an essential condition for the prevention of coercion. The recognition of property is clearly the first step in the delimitation of the private sphere, which protects us against coercion, and it has long been recognized that a people averse to the institution of private property is without the first element of freedom.
What he is getting at in The Road to Serfdom, which is ultimately published in 1944, is it's a warning to the Western world that there are many intellectuals, but many regular people as well, that have fallen in thrall to socialist promises, that they can have it all. They can have greater prosperity, equality, as well as all of these liberties that we have become accustomed to in the Western world. Hayek's warning is that this is not possible. He explains that oppression will inevitably take place, that there is no way to avoid it. Once we have the publication of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, we see actual first-hand evidence that the predictions made by Hayek were in fact taking place in the Soviet Union.
The causes of the collapse of the USSR are obviously somewhat complex. One cannot point to any single event. The Soviets were under increasing strategic and military pressure from Washington, of the Reagan administration, both with the conventional arms buildup, also the Strategic Defense Initiative had put a lot of pressure on the Soviets to match technological innovation, to keep up in the arms race.
All of the contradictions of the socialist system of production were coming to a head.
Modernization of... When Reagan came into the presidency in 1981 and declared that the fate of the Soviet Union would be inevitably to land in the ash heap of history and that Soviet Russia was an evil empire, that brought the Cold War to its final phase, you might say, when the competition ratcheted up to a point where the Russians just couldn't keep up. In the spring of 1985, they got a reformist leader finally in Mikhail Gorbachev. But when he tried to fix things, he found that the house, really, the more you tried to fix it, the more it wanted to fall down. And ultimately, it did.
The Soviet system shows you have a repressive system which maintains itself by tyranny and terror. When you loosen the reins on that, you run the risk of these other elements that people like Solzhenitsyn talk about in human nature. People begin to think for themselves. People begin to wonder why they can't have a better life, more freedom. Above all else, for Solzhenitsyn, you triumph over totalitarianism by resisting lies. His point is Marxism is a vast construct of ideological lies about what it means to be a human being.
Despite the power of Solzhenitsyn's writings and the irrefutable arguments of Mises and Hayek, communists would not be deterred from spreading their ideology across the globe. And before the collapse of the USSR, the loathsome theory had already taken root in a country where revolutionaries had established an even firmer grip. The fall of the Soviet Union in December 1991, With the fall of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the truth about conditions within the country became undeniable. Marx's vision of a classless society had failed. Instead of prosperity and equality, communism in the Soviet Union had produced the largest death toll of any human undertaking in history. But despite the collapse of its most prominent laboratory, communism as an ideology was far from over. In fact, because of the Soviet Union's successful propaganda over the previous decades, communism was on the verge of its most vigorous expansion yet.
The appearance of what had happened in the Soviet Union gave hope in these less developed countries that they could rapidly modernize. The Soviets had taken over a largely agricultural economy and had very rapidly modernized it at terrible cost, with lots of economic problems that were hidden, though, if you're in these less developed countries.
Communism spread into other nations with the help of Soviet funding and training, accelerated by Stalin's conquest and victory in World War II. As it became entrenched in other nations, it had the same result there as in the USSR. Flagrant injustice, unimaginable atrocities, and catastrophic economic collapse.
So Stalin died in 1953, and the legacy that he left behind was a horrific one. And even the Soviet Republic actually had to contend with that. So when Khrushchev emerged as the next leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, he in fact was willing to deal with the atrocities that were committed under Stalin.
It did signal that maybe the longhorns and fangs that had characterized Stalin's regime were going to disappear, although the secret police apparatus was still retained under Khrushchev, and the suspicion of Soviet territorial ambitions in terms of undermining Western democracies and turning them into communist regimes, all that remained. So the Cold War barely missed a beat once Stalin died and Khrushchev emerged.
Communism spread by the sword to Eastern Europe as well as China in the wake of the Second World War. None of these regimes ever had a huge amount of popular purchase. A country such as East Germany was much less prosperous than West Germany on any possible available metric. That didn't necessarily mean all of the people were unhappy. It didn't mean that communism fulfilled their needs. Rather, in the absence of other distractions and not knowing, it was only once they knew how much more prosperous people were in West Germany. That's what made them unhappy. So long as they didn't know, perhaps they were happy in their ignorance.
Eastern European economies were socialist economies, just as the Soviet Union economy was. These socialist economies were under the control of the communist parties of each country.
They weren't prosperous exactly, but their lives were simpler. When I would meet Russians, Eastern Europeans too, but particularly Russians in the 1990s, a generational gap that you would often notice is that younger people who had not fully grown up under communism, or perhaps who had grown up under the era after communism, they were obviously a bit more westernized in their sensibilities. They were also willing to work harder, go to work for Western companies where you were actually expected to put in a long day at work. And you wouldn't have the all-union smoke break at 11 a.m. Everyone wouldn't be drunk on the tractor combine in the farms. Some people preferred that kind of life. You didn't really have to think very hard. You didn't have to work very hard.
At endless rallies, they proclaim it. Peace, peace. A great and a beautiful word, peace.
I grew up in Yugoslavia, a country which no longer exists. It came apart in the early 90s during the brutal civil war. It initially started after the end of World War II, being under the dominance of Stalin and adopting a Stalinist economic system. The Communist Party in Yugoslavia was led by so-called Marshal Tito.
The Yugoslav Communist Party, led by Tito, resisted being simply a client of Moscow. And he sort of positioned himself between the West and the Soviet Union.
Tito, in fact, gradually started diminishing the government control over the society, to the point that in the mid-60s, he said, listen, people can leave Yugoslavia freely. So there was an emigration of a lot of people that started sending back a lot of money, which is what Tito wanted. And he instituted a very interesting system of socialism that he referred to as worker self-management. So he said, rather than central planning, we're going to have workers, through democratic means, decide how these factories are going to be run. And that caught the imagination of a lot of Western intellectuals. They started latching onto the Yugoslav experiment, and they started saying, this is the better way forward for socialism. Tito was a great hero to many on the left in the Western world. He died in 1980, and Yugoslavia just started collapsing immediately.
On the surface, their economy seemed to do quite well. That was unfortunately a house of cards, which collapsed and collapsed hard.
It turned out that the reason why Yugoslavia actually looked pretty attractive in the 1970s had nothing to do with worker self-management, which was another failure. It didn't work, but rather because we were getting massive amounts of loans from the World Bank and other Western institutions. The International Monetary Fund was giving us a lot of money, and once Tito died, they lost faith that Yugoslavia would be able to stay together, and they started asking for their money back. And by the late 80s, there was one of the worst cases of hyperinflation on record, leading to the total economic collapse and then the collapse of the entire country and entry into a horrific civil war.
With a firm grip on Central and Eastern Europe, the USSR continued attempting to spread communism across the globe. An opportunity arose right on the Soviets' doorstep with the tumultuous rise of Mao Zedong in China.
Traditional China and traditional Chinese beliefs sort of falling apart in the early first decade of the 20th century. China had to decide, what are we going to do now? Well, one of the ideologies that gave answers to this question was Marxism. I think Chinese communism was especially potent because it promised relief to the ordinary peasant, which would be the vast bulk of the Chinese population. Poor people who lived on the land or off of the land, very harsh conditions, and you're promised your life will be better. In the Soviets, in the wake of decolonization and things like that, they spend a lot of time aiding indigenous Marxist movements and bringing elites in those countries to the Soviet Union to train them, to give them a Marxist education and technical education too.
Mao Zedong was the leader of the communist movement within China long before China became a communist nation. And he, like many others in China, were competing with each other for domination.
Mao and the Chinese Communist Party were not particularly successful, at least at first, in making major inroads in China.
China became communist after almost 4 decades of civil war, and this is also mixed in with the Japanese invasion of China, which begins 10 years earlier than our involvement in World War II, for instance, in 1931, and then stepping up again further in 1937. So you have this long period of tremendous upheaval. After World War II, the two main groups in China, the nationalist and the communist, the communists were greatly aggrandized, especially by Soviet victory, which put them very close to China.
The Soviets actually set up a military academy. This is somewhat unusual in China, the so-called Wampo Military Academy, which was actually set up in the early 1920s. A lot of the military officers who would later help to direct and lead the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, which came into its own under Mao and the Chinese Civil War, were actually trained by Soviet military advisors. So the relationship between Mao and his Soviet sponsors is an interesting one. We do know from documentary sources that he was on the Soviet payroll as early as 1921. They bought various train tickets for him and started subsidizing the party. Mao clearly had his own ambitions, his own ideas, his own interpretation of Marxism, but he was absolutely a Soviet client from the earliest days.
Chinese communism has the core of Marxism, but some differences. There's more play for the imagination and will, and less of a dependence on science in important Maoist measures. One example of this sort of reliance on the imagination and willfulness in Maoism is the idea that if you plant crops deeper, they'll grow up taller and stronger and you'll have more food, instead of they just don't come up at all because you have to plant them in an appropriate way to get them to work at all. So you have these, very fanciful, imaginative measures, often carried through with great brutality, that end up transforming whole segments of society.
Mao did think of himself as a Marxist-Leninist, or Marxist-Leninist-Stalinist, if you wish. And he said that, described himself that way in his writings.
The target is the Chinese Revolution. The arrow is Marxism-Leninism. We Chinese communists have been seeking this arrow because we want to hit the target of the Chinese Revolution and of the Revolution of the East.
China was starting from a position of dire poverty. There was hardly any railroads in China. China itself wasn't really a nation to begin with. It was all disparate warlords running around throughout most of the 20th century, killing each other. And China was not really a country. Russia was, and that was something the Soviets could build on. So when the Chinese tried to do it, it was even a greater disaster than what it was under the Soviets.
A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. To put it bluntly, it is necessary to create terror for a while in every rural area.
A lot of what Mao brought to China, as far as both what we might call macroeconomic policy planning, abolition of private property, confiscation, a lot of this drew on the Soviet tradition. There was also a very specific xenophobic edge to the Chinese purges of the early 1950s. In some ways, it was similar to the anti-foreign elements of the Great Terror in Russia. In China, they made it explicit. They actually built these things called denunciation boxes. They were bright red, so you could denounce someone for being either a foreign sympathizer, an agent of the American imperialists, or perhaps something as simple as a class enemy. And hundreds of thousands of people availed themselves of these denunciation boxes. I've seen different statistics, something like 1.2 million reports of suspected neighbors or family members were filed Maybe as many as 3 million were arrested or sent off to, in many cases, what were called re-education camps. There was a xenophobic anti-foreign element. There was an element of re-education. There was a systematic element of people being encouraged to denounce their neighbors and family members. At times there were death quotas. They would usually be labeled in terms of percentages. That is not a raw, outright number of people to be executed, but rather a targeted percentage. You were supposed to round up or kill a certain number of people in certain areas. But quite explicitly murderous in very much the same way that the quotas were enforced in the Soviet Union. Now, scarcely had that campaign wound down, then Mao launched the campaign we usually call the Great Leap Forward. As he put it, and they always had phrases to crystallize and define these ideas, China would, quote, walk on two legs at once. By that he meant that she would both industrialize and also mass collectivize agriculture.
To distribute resources evenly will only ruin the Great Leap Forward. There is not enough to eat. People starve to death. It is better to let half the people die so that the other half can eat their fill.
They realized that this would effectively kill lots of people, and they talked quite openly about this. They even talked about things such as per million units of cubic soil moved, how many people will die, and that we will accept that price. Well, long story short, it didn't work very well. As one poor, suffering Chinese worker, and it was kind of conscripted into all of this, said, he said, we tried a great leap, but we broke our bones. Even the Chinese Communist government admitted, I believe in 1988, that something like 20 million people had starved to death, and that was the government estimate. The best estimates now come out somewhere in the mid-40s, that is the mid-40 millions. Perhaps 45 million people died in the span of about 3 or 4 years, roughly between 1958 and 1962.
I'd known about floods, but had been persuaded there was relief. Through the parties concerned, such problems were supposed to be solved. But as our train went through Honan, I saw corpses and people in flight from disaster everywhere. There were half-naked people along the tracks begging for food. The train passengers, mostly party cadre, were moved to pity and threw food out the windows. Groups of people fought over the food. On our way back home through this area, the window shades were ordered drawn, and we weren't permitted to look outside. Afterward, party officials forbade us to talk about what we had seen.
Probably the greatest killer of his own people in all world history is Mao, not Stalin, not Hitler. And those policies that Mao introduced, and then later the Cultural Revolution, where they basically went after anybody who was educated in society and made life hard for them, both of those policies held the Chinese back from developing their economy at all.
Mao's murderous and genocidal reign ended with his death on September 9, 1976, with tens of millions dead and what was left of the Chinese people living in grinding poverty. China was in desperate need of revitalization.
Deng Xiaoping was one of the senior figures in the Chinese Communist Party. He was the highest ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party who was effectively either disowned or briefly denounced by Mao in the course of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, or as we call it today, the Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966, denounced as a capitalist rotor. There were various phrases of abuse that were hurled at dissident or rival communist members. In the long run, this might have helped his reputation. He was rehabilitated, actually, while Mao was still alive in 1974, but was still frequently denounced at meetings of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. And this gave him a little bit of a reputation as, if not a skeptic, then something of a maverick, and word of this actually leaked out abroad, and this eventually, I think, worked to his advantage. Once Deng Xiaoping emerged himself as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party later in the 1970s, this reputation for at least some level of independence from orthodox doctrine, I think, served him very well. He realized that for all of the alleged achievements of communism in China, they still left much to be desired in the economic or technological sense. Which is not the same as saying that he abandoned the ideals of communism. Rather, he thought that China could learn from Japan and from the West, and in particular from the United States, ideally without paying full price.
There is no fundamental contradiction between socialism and the market economy. The problem is how to develop the productive forces more effectively. Our experience over the years has proved that having a totally planned economy hampers the development of the productive forces. If we combine a planned economy with a market economy, we should be in a better position to leverage the productive forces and speed up economic growth.
And in this, he succeeded. China, in fact, did not have to make any of the same concessions that countries like the Soviet Union had made in exchange for favorable trade deals and actually getting the most favored nation status. And this launched a long period, really, from 1979 almost up to the present day, when China has benefited tremendously from her access to the U.S. market, her access to various U.S. technologies and patents, and in particular, the ability to copy, reverse engineer, or simply steal patents and intellectual property from the West. Perhaps you might say Mao's mistake was trying to out-Stalin Stalin, to do a version of Stalin's 5-year plans, a kind of hypertrophic modernization campaign, which had failed quite brutally and abysmally and led to vast death and destruction and really the impoverishment of China. So as late as the early 1980s, even as Deng Xiaoping's economic experiments were beginning to proceed, China was still a desperately poor country. The aim all along, however, was not to liberalize China, certainly not politically, but to allow her to catch up to the West. While the Western business press was agog with all of the reforms and the apparent liberalization of China in the 1980s, China was also conducting the so-called one-child policy, which led, among other things, to vast numbers of kind of hideous late-term abortions as Chinese people were trying to keep up with the government regulations, not allowing them to have more than one child. This was not a government which was about to forfeit its political prerogatives or its political control.
China was an interesting example because it had started implementing pretty serious market reforms in the 1980s, even in the late 1970s. So we started seeing those substantial reforms that were truly changing the material wealth of the regular people in China. But still, the Chinese people tried to bring an end to the communist rule of China. China, unlike Russia and Eastern European countries, did not hesitate in crushing the uprising.
The key episode as far as the maintenance of Chinese Communist Party control over the country was almost certainly the Tiananmen Square uprising of May and June of 1989, and then its brutal crushing by the People's Liberation Army in early June 1989.
Just absolute slaughter of the protesters. It has allowed the Communist Party of China to remain in control of China to this day.
This was an effective signal to the world that while a certain level of economic experimentation was being encouraged, no political liberalization of any kind was going to be allowed.
On the one hand, in China, you have great changes since the 80s in Chinese economic life. much greater prosperity. On the other hand, you have a fiercely repressive regime. The ordinary experience of life in China is not one of freedom or even close to it.
Despite that crackdown on at least human rights, they actually continued to free up the economy all through the 90s and into the early part of the 21st century. We saw greater number of people being pulled out of poverty as a result of the market reforms done by China than ever before.
Since Deng Xiaoping, China has emerged as a more serious, I think, economic rival for the United States and the West than was ever really expected. The secret of China's success is not one that I fully understand myself. That is to say, how is it that this rigid totalitarian political structure has been able to coexist with increasing levels of entrepreneurship, market activity, while maintaining ultimate state control over the economy?
Chinese society now is really a corrupt, oligarchic, repressive regime that allows a fair amount of economic activity that has raised the standards of many millions of the lives of Chinese.
Much like the Soviet Union in its heyday, the Chinese Communist Party still runs forced labor camps, effectively slave labor camps, as we might call them. Obviously, there are elements of re-education camps as well, entire people like the Uyghurs, movements such as Falun Gong that have been suppressed, dissidents in places like Hong Kong. The Chinese Communist Party has in many ways perfected not just the art of social surveillance of the population, but also mass repression and exploitation of poorly paid or slave labor in terms of its economy.
Is China still a communist country today? Yes and no. Because yes, officially they call themselves a communist country, a Marxist country, but they always add a caveat or footnote by saying, well, yes, but in a new style and in a Chinese manner and so on.
I don't believe China is a communist country, except insofar as it's run by an organization which calls itself the Communist Party. And Communist Party membership is decisive for being in the leadership, of course, but there's no attempt, I don't think, even a pretense of aiming at bringing about the classless society.
I think we should maybe take the Chinese Communist Party at its word, that whatever it is they're doing, it is still communism. It's just a modified version of communism, which they have figured out works. I think in some ways what you can see under Deng Xiaoping and his successors is the efforts of Chinese communists to learn from history, that is, to avoid the most egregious mistakes of people like Stalin and Mao, and instead learn from the aspects of their policies which actually did work. Foreign technology transfer, industrial espionage, opportunistic trade deals, leveraging, that is, every asset that they have in order to maintain party control and party dominance over the Chinese economy, and increasingly, of course, a vast swathe of the global economy.
Now please join me in a warm applause to welcome the General Secretary and other Political Bureau Standing Committee members.
Xi Jinping is the head of state in China, that is, he's president of the People's Republic of China, and he's also the general secretary of the Communist Party, so effectively he runs both party and state. I think the goal of China today, of any CCP or Communist Party government in China, remains the ultimate reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. That's the primary goal. Whether that happens through war, through some type of blockade, or perhaps even through a kind of voluntary submission, I think is still a matter of uncertainty. But I think this is the primary foreign policy goal of the People's Republic of China. As far as the broader goals domestically, I think to maintain control, obviously to maintain some level of economic growth in order to both pacify and keep the population mostly on board with the government, while maintaining a firmer hand, you might say, on dissidents in any groups such as the Uyghurs who threaten the party's hold on power.
They've actually started bringing larger and larger parts of the economy back under the control of the Communist Party. And of course, are spreading into attempting to influence the rest of the world. China remains this kind of a socialist economy, though a hybrid.
The most remarkable aspect of the story of communism in China to me is the simple endurance of the Chinese people. Those who endured, who suffered, those who were re-educated, those who were arrested, those who were deported. Obviously, many of them were murdered in cold blood or starved to death. I think it's quite remarkable that the country maintains such a level of vitality and energy today. Of course, we don't know for sure what all of those Chinese people, all those mute victims who suffered or who died, who were killed or murdered in the various purges, the repressions of the Great Leap Forward, of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, or the other high-profile episodes of repression in Chinese history. We don't know what they would have thought, or what the dissidents of Tiananmen Square would have thought of today's China. Perhaps we can only wonder what they would have made of today's China and its alleged achievements.
Despite Marxism's repressive and violent history across the USSR, its satellite states, and China, fascination with Marx's writings in the Western world has not declined. In fact, shockingly, Marx's writings seem to be gaining popularity in the affluent, developed West.
Frankly, it's appalling to me how many people today in this country express a preference for socialism. If only we could live under socialism. 35-40%, I think, in a recent poll.
It has been a very interesting and quite remarkable development that over the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen this resurgence of interest in ideas of socialism.
I don't think Marxism is going away anytime soon because he provides such a powerful framework for a large commercial economy.
In the whole story of socialism during the 20th century especially, is first of all to remember that the system collapsed after 75 years in Russia. The system collapsed because at the end of the day it was just not workable. It's not workable to deprive people of basic freedoms. The freedom to be imaginative, the freedom to live well.
Socialists are constantly trying to find the new version of socialism that's going to work better, and every one of those fails.
Despite communism's unfailing record of devastation and ruin everywhere it has been implemented, history continues to repeat itself. Against all reason and decency, Marxism, socialism, and communism have retained a foothold in the United States, and in some quarters, have grown in popularity and influence. Since the Communist Manifesto was published in 1848, the fine points and precise details of Marx's argument have been lost. As the ideological debate became widespread throughout the West, Marx's acolytes and opponents seemed to grow increasingly zealous.
We maybe mouth the pieties of Marxism in the sense that we talk about making everybody equal, but nobody's really pushing for that. What we are pushing for, and what is powerful today, is part of what Marx thought of as genuine human liberation from all of the constraints of the past. What Marx really deep down wanted the most was the complete destruction of Western civilization.
Industrial designers and architects promise modern man a life of smooth efficiency. Material progress, which has given man so many new conveniences, has at the same time speeded up the tempo of his life.
In general, what has happened is that socialism has emerged as a discredited ideal. It seemed like they were dead, basically, that we were at the end of history and socialism did not present any kind of an appealing model at all going forward. But what seemed to have happened is that all of the Marxians, they did not just wither away and die. They, in fact, fled to academia. And in academia, they continued to spread these ideas and refine these ideas.
What you see in the 1950s is a reworking of Marxism to make it friendly. And there is a fundamental rejection of the orthodox Marxism. In the 1950s, it's usually thought that Marxist economics is a kind of junk science. And all of the new Marxist humanists, somebody like an Erich Fromm is aware of that. How is it possible, I think many of those who called themselves Marxists in the 1950s, how is it possible to say that capitalism doesn't deliver the goods? And so they're not making the argument that socialism leads to superior forms of production. What they're arguing is that capitalism is inferior because it alienates human beings from their true humanity. So Marxist humanism is involved in a social critique of capitalism, but it's laid aside the economic tenets of Marxism.
In particular, what we started seeing is the greater reliance on what's come to be known as critical theory, which is associated with the Frankfurt School in Germany from the 1920s on, which was highly influenced by Marxist thought, but was attempting to either somehow modify Marx or add to Marx.
The Frankfurt School was a group of intellectuals who started the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. And those who were selected were Marxists. Some of the leading figures were Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. Somebody like Adorno was interested in musicology. Erich Fromm was a psychoanalyst. Herbert Marcuse was a philosopher. So this group would engage in a new kind of research, and it starts to ask new questions. Why did the Soviet Union become so oppressive? And why is it that communism loses the battle against fascism in the streets of Berlin and other places? And the Frankfurt School contributes a very important idea, which is, in these modern Western nations, the workers had been bought off. And their answer was, we need to combine with Marx a Freudian study of the mechanisms of repression. How do you get someone to work all day long? It's not simply by coercion or necessity, that there are psychological measures that are taken as part of the indoctrination of the workers in society.
As naturally as the ruled always took the morality imposed upon them more seriously than did the rulers themselves, the deceived masses are today captivated by the myth of success even more than the successful are. Immovably, they insist on the very ideology which enslaves them. The misplaced love of the common people for the wrong which is done to them is a greater force than the cunning of the authorities.
And some of these thinkers were Freudians. Wilhelm Reich was probably the central character. And he thought that the solution, and this is the same with the Frankfurt School, they were asking the same question, why did the communist revolution fail in Germany, which was the industrial center of the world where the revolution was supposed to take place? And so they are going to introduce a new kind of philosophy called critical theory. And critical theory becomes the dominant political philosophy of the latter half of the 20th century.
Any kind of a traditional theory, these critical theories would claim, is designed to preserve the current power structures. And those current power structures are intended to exploit some groups to help other groups.
There's a reworking of Marx in Marxist humanism and an appeal to Marx's social critique of life under capitalism and the alienation that occurs, how human beings are divorced from community, how they pick up and they uproot and they move 1,500 miles away to work for a corporation. That liberalism was involved in social planning that destroyed spontaneous creativity that was part of human nature. While Western liberalism at the time, in the 1950s and the 60s, was seen to deliver the goods economically, that it was a dehumanized mode of existence. Working in a cubicle or working in an office, the man in the gray flannel suit who spends all of his day in an office and then he comes home and he turns on the television. He's too exhausted even to have sex. So this is a critique of the state capitalist way of life under liberalism. That's the Marxist humanist critique.
Under the rule of the performance principle, body and mind are made into instruments of the alienated labor. The distribution of time plays a fundamental role in this transformation. If the average working day, including preparation and travel to and from work, amounts to 10 hours, and if the biological needs for sleep and nourishment require another 10 hours, the free time would be 4 out of each 24 hours throughout the greater part of the individual's life. This free time would be potentially available for pleasure, but from the working day, alienation and regimentation spread into the free time.
For Marcuse, what you want is revolt, you want revolution. And it was Marcuse that argues for a white privileged elite, the white radicals, to unite in solidarity with what he called the wretched of the earth. And by that, he meant third world peoples of color. He meant women who were oppressed by a patriarchal system, and he advocated those who were oppressed by gender. He advocates polymorphous perversity to overthrow the old social mores. So you find a more direct line from Marcuse and the Frankfurt School in critical theory to its applications in critical legal studies in the 1970s to the politics of difference in the 1980s and 90s and all of the schools that we see today.
The first transgender operation was conducted around 1930 in Germany in an institute run by cultural Marxists there. That became then hugely influential in the U.S. An example of this, Herbert Marcuse, he came over to the U.S. One of his first important jobs was within the CIA. He became an important figure in American government. Then went on to become a famous university professor and wrote books about cultural Marxism, about the need to cut sex off from anything to do with stability, order, tradition. There had to be complete liberation of man from any idea of morality or religion.
Critical theorists started looking at the world in a very Marxian way, through the Marxian lens. What they started looking at is which groups are the ones that wield power and which ones are the oppressed, the exploited groups, and how can we change those power dynamics? This is what started being peddled to a great extent in the United States academia.
The most influential form of Marxism today, it's just what we call today liberalism. What they mean by that is what the intellectuals are calling cultural Marxism.
Cultural Marxism is a way of criticizing the culture of Western liberal society. And it is called Marxism because it's looking back to Marx's humanist writings, where instead of Marx just referring to an economic science and a socialist revolution and a communist consciousness, right, as he does in Das Kapital, and a critique of the economic system, there is a critique of Western liberalism on humanist grounds. If you look at the feminist radicals of the late 1960s, they're arguing that patriarchal oppression is prior to economic oppression. It's more fundamental than class oppression. All modern radicals today are going to talk about a form of class oppression. They're going to talk about how large corporations have too much power and are involved in the oppression of workers. Whether they prioritize that or whether they prioritize genderism and racism depends on the particular radical.
People today think of Marx as a guy interested only in economic transformation of society. These cultural Marxists rightly pointed out that was only part of Marxism. You might say Marx is the father of the concept of relationships, where everything is fluid. And the cultural Marxists, the people who came along in the 20th century to develop these ideas, that's why they glommed onto the notion of sexuality outside of heterosexual and marital sex.
It often happens that a boy or a girl, before finding a partner who suits them, searches around for some time, sleeps with this or that person, and goes on searching. There's absolutely no reason to denigrate this.
The principal idea of cultural Marxism is, unlike the political changes required by the older orthodox Marxism, is to change society at the level of culture. So you sort of start from the private. You start through things like schools instead of revolutionary violence.
And that is crystallized into this, what we now call critical race theory. Critical race theory posits that the major class struggle can be really thought of not necessarily in terms of socioeconomic classes, but in fact in terms of race and gender. So that we have this struggle between whites and blacks that's been in place for hundreds of years now, that is the primary reality for the American experiment. That everything that has happened in terms of the adoption of the institutions in the United States from its founding to today has been intended to keep down the black people, brown people, and take advantage of them by white people. And similarly, to have men take advantage of women through various kinds of patriarchy. So you started seeing this generation of younger teachers. They were going out there and teaching in public schools in particular that this was their worldview. That they thought of all of life, all of history, all of society strictly in terms of power struggles. And those power struggles needed to be changed.
When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are at a very frustrating state of affairs at the moment, where we are moving forward and backward at the same time.
These movements we see in the contemporary world, the DEI idea, the idea that diversity, equity, inclusion needs to be pushed in schools, in corporations, in workplaces, that's cultural Marxist consciousness raising. It's related to that. You're going to be lectured. You're going to be nudged, they sometimes say today. Like your performance might be evaluated in part on how you deal with these DEI goals. That's very much the cultural Marxist methodology.
And so this is where we are today, that you have had a lot of these people that have been, younger people in particular, that have been educated in critical race theory, that believe that their goal is to fundamentally change socioeconomic relations in the United States, to change those power relations. And that they start seeing that they can do that now through changes in how corporations are acting. So we are now seeing the most recent, the latest attempt to have socialism. And this is ultimately what ties together all these different versions of socialism. Every one of these visions of socialism has a kind of a utopian endpoint, that a more just world, a better world is the goal. And the only way to achieve that better world, that goal, is through massive application of government power.
The utopian promises they're making really are a substitute religion, and it provides a sense of meaning and purpose to the children of the upper middle class and of the wealthy. But ultimately it falls hollow. There's no real transcendence there, because the very promise of Marxism is a thoroughly profane society, that you'll be free from all the repressive moral constraints. Well, what does that lead to in practice? it leads to thorough meaninglessness, or it is reduced to raw power.
A lot of people thought that, certainly in the United States, but in the Western world in general, that ideas of socialism were pretty much dead. And it was something that started changing quite dramatically with one particular event. I think that's the financial crisis of 2008, 2009.
When the crash came, it took just about everyone by surprise, both in the scale as well as in the speed.
For decades and decades, the argument had been that capitalism will make everyone wealthy. What happens in 2008 is a radical readjustment in which the older schools of thought, namely a Marxist view of economics, resurges. There are economists who say Marxism is more relevant now than ever. Why? Because Marx's fundamental critique of capitalism, that it led to monopolies, has proven true. One of the problems with the free market ideology that comes out of the 1960s is free markets become an end in and of themselves, and that they just presuppose that a growth in wealth translates into human happiness, but they don't clarify who's going to get wealthy, or they presuppose that the wealth will trickle down to all. Milton Friedman said that we don't need to prosecute antitrust anymore. The only trust that should be broken apart, according to Friedman, according to Robert Bork, according to Alan Greenspan, would be labor unions. So what you have in the late 70s, really under Reagan in the 1980s, is the rise of finance capitalism and the creation of monopolies in every sector of the American economy. The older Americans never would have tolerated that. That was one of the great claims that the American founders made against the British, is that the British had restricted them in certain fundamental rights through the creation of monopolies. It had restricted the colonies, viewing them as a means for resources for production that would benefit the mother country. For all of the arguments of the 1960s and 70s, the Milton Friedmans, the Robert Borks on antitrust, that capitalism can deliver the goods to average Americans, by the 2008 housing market crisis, that had come into question. Why is it that the standard of living, or why is it that real wages had not increased for average Americans from the early 70s on into the next 30 years? Why is it that the division, the divide between the have and the have-nots, between the 1% and the 99% had gotten larger?
This was a very dramatic event, certainly for millennials. This was the first time that they had ever lived through any kind of drastic economic change, where they started seeing their parents losing their jobs, losing their homes quite often. So you start seeing the unleashing of dissatisfaction with the current system in the United States by the younger people that takes form in the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Another way that Marx proved prescient was that Marx argued that in the late stage of capitalism, that capitalism itself would tend to a growth in the number of monopolies. And if you look at the monopolies in the American economy, they've increased ever since the refusal of the Department of Justice to enforce antitrust. And the usual defense of those monopolies is well, they provide services and goods that we all need. That those businesses just want profit. It's the government that's bad, and government needs to get out of business. Now, the problem with that is that the businesses, the corporations, and government are the same entity. Google is the US government. The Pentagon's its largest client. Facebook is the government. It's infiltrated with FBI agents, former FBI agents, who use the monopoly on American platforms for speech to control speech and to censor dissidents. And that's a prediction that Marx made. Who was bailed out after the Great Recession? Well, it was J.P. Morgan. It was Goldman Sachs. Come to find out, if you were just an average American who wanted a reprieve or a break on your home mortgage, well, that was in dispute. Are we going to bail out jobs for average Americans? I don't know. That's controversial. But when it comes to the largest corporations, what we find is a greater centralization of banking and industry after 2008. And Marx would say, I was right. So I think that the power of orthodox Marxism has shown itself and will probably never go away in an order of international commerce.
What this campaign is about is urging the American people to think outside of the box, to look at the status quo, not as it has to be, but in ways that we can change it.
Democratic socialism has become a major buzzword with people like Bernie Sanders. And he talks about achieving democratic socialism, that he wants to get to a society that is going to emulate those socialist economic aspects. And Bernie Sanders has had a massive impact on that conversation in the United States today, gaining millions of followers, especially younger followers, younger people that are finding his message highly appealing.
Democratic socialism, the financial crisis of 2008, sort of brought that up, you might say, like maybe as a way to address this crisis occasioned by these very powerful banks. So there's been lots of talk of democratic socialism since then.
As to those in this country, the United States, who would self-describe as socialists, I think what they're missing is, and inevitably, democratic socialists would vest more controls over economic decisions, what gets built, what doesn't. The flip side of socialism is deprivation of individual freedom. I think it's just an idea that sounds good, but is just ultimately unworkable and full of all kinds of injustice that fly in the face of what this country was built on and what, in most quarters, the United States professes still to stand for.
I think that Marxism invariably leads to totalitarianism because it views society as fragmented by different classes that have no obligations of morality or justice to one another. Marxism, in one way, is very persuasive and applicable because Marx is addressing questions that are thousands of years old. And if you read Aristotle, he talks about the divide between the few and the many. And Marx is taking a side in that dispute, which will always plague political societies. The reason I think that Marxism is so appealing is because of the radical inequalities of wealth that are, to me, indisputable today. How is it that you can defend mere capitalism if it leads to the destruction of the family because we open up a market for every form of degradation that helps to destroy the family? The libertarian position that was adopted by conservatives all throughout the 1980s, in which we are introducing into American society all the things that destroy the family, where the state has to come in and play a role that the family used to play. How is it you're ever going to defend the older model if you adopt a libertarian position? That's one of the challenges, I think, for the certain libertarian school of thought. But I also think that you could look to the Republican ideals of the 19th century and of the founding period, and they have answers to those questions.
Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community.
The great threat to every political regime, says Madison famously in Federalist 10, is faction. Faction is a real problem because you have citizens who no longer see one another as deserving the same natural rights under the law, under the civil law. And the founders designed a system where they wanted to multiply the interest groups in society as well as to expand the republic. But I think what's important is we're not talking about a society that's so fragmented that it has nothing in common. Madison at the end of Federalist 10 is very clear. You want to have all kinds of interests in your political order, but they need to have something in common. And here you could look at, say, Federalist 2, where John Jay describes that you have a common people. They are rooted from a common ethnicity, use a common language, have the same religion. And why was that important? Well, it's because if you're going to have people that are going to sacrifice and die for a nation, they need to have something in common that they think is more important than life itself.
Providence has been pleased to give us this one connected country, to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established their general liberty and independence.
So to understand the founders, it was how to, right? You have the e pluribus unum, out of many one. What they meant by that were the various states that were very different from one another, right after the revolution. But they needed to forge a common identity. And so despite all of the differences in property ownership, in wealth, and in so on, there was a certain natural law that they could appeal to, a certain view of ethics and morality that would inform the citizens.
We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution, as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other.
The founders looked at the potential for faction, and they said, we need to resolve the problem. Marx looked at the modern regime, and all he saw was the faction. The thing that the founders viewed as a problem and tried their best to control for is the very thing that Marx wants to take and run with to lead us to a global society.
At their core, the constitutional republic established by the American founders and Marx's classless society both attempt to fundamentally address the issue of faction and class divides. The question is whether the founders or Marx is right. Can faction be subordinated to the common good for all the members of a society? Can the rights of all be protected by a government that preserves liberty? Or was Marx correct that class conflict was an historical inevitability? That all society is merely a constantly shifting power dynamic of oppressor and oppressed?
The irony for all these socialists is that the goals that they're trying to achieve can't actually be achieved through liberty, through simple economic and political freedom.
The American founders believed that if you stress the rights of citizenship and they were informed by the right ethical, moral, and political teaching, that you can stave off the class divides that Marx assumed would be part of every single society.
What we observe is that every time that we actually go with true liberty, where it's up to each one of us individually what we make of ourselves, that there is a remarkable triumph of human energy and human ingenuity that leads us to, in fact, creating a better society.
We're in a situation where we are following Marx's guide to try to overcome or abolish human nature. And it's not going to work for us any more than it did for Stalin in the 1930s and 40s. There will be a reassertion of the natural inclinations and instincts of human beings.
The most brutal, most repressive, wildest utopian schemes are Marxist.
I think communism, the failure of the communist experiment, showed that the more decisions government takes for people, the less freedom they have.
Liberty inevitably leads to a better society.
Actual socialism, the denial of private property and rights, doesn't work economically and produces human misery in every other way.
Socialism is always fundamentally the negation of liberty.